I invite you to walk with me, Sancho Panza, out of our village lane on a clear morning, when dew still rims the vine leaves and the hens have not yet finished arguing with dawn. At my gate stood a gaunt hidalgo from La Mancha, eyes bright as a newly whetted sickle. He called himself Don Quixote and declared that justice had found a rider. "Come with me, Sancho," he said, "and when right is restored, you shall govern an island." I am a man who fears an empty pot more than a ghost, yet the word island rang the pan inside me like a spoon against its rim, cheerful, insistent, a little foolish. Behind me, Teresa folded a cloth. Our Sanchica rubbed sleep from her eyes and waved the way children wave to a departing cart. I looked at them longer than usual, as if a look could be packed like bread, to be unwrapped later on the road. We left before the sun opened both eyes. Don Quixote took the lead upon the bony Rocinante. I followed on my grey Ruccio with a wineskin, 2 loaves, and a stiff wedge of cheese. He spoke of Dulcinea del Tobosote lady, whose name steadied his heart as a keel steadies a boat, and I, honest as a soup ladle, thought of the pot of beans at home and hoped it would not burn. Still, I nodded at his sentences. A dream needs 2 pairs of feet to get anywhere, the dreamer's, and another pair willing to believe on his behalf. That morning I volunteered my feet, though one ankle stayed tied by a thread to my doorstep. Let me offer a detail as solid as a nail in a post. His armour was patched like a roof after many rains, and the helmet had the persuasive shape of a dented basin, a sight faithful readers will remember from our early travels. Yet when he buckled them on, he straightened, and his face took on a small moon's brightness. People say clothes make the cleric. I have seen willpower stitch plate better than any needle. By a squat olive tree he paused to instruct me. "To earn your island, Sancho, you must look with the eyes of justice." I smiled inwardly. Justice in my vineyard begins with 2 honest baskets on the scale, one for the owner, one for the picker. But I nodded and tied his words to my memory as I tie a bundle of sticks to Ruccio's back. As we went, he recited the lineages of famous knights, men who struck the wind until even the wind bowed, men who walked a forest and the leaves confessed their secrets. Names of villains and enchanters poured from him like grain from a torn sack. I heard much and understood little. But when a man speaks with his whole heart, even strange words are warm as fresh bread. One breaks off a piece and finds it agreeable. To loosen the air, I told him about our neighbour who combs his rooster every morning and calls it a noble bird, yet when debt taps the door, the noble bird becomes soup. Don Quixote laughed and said, "Even a rooster, if it has honour, deserves respect." "True," I answered, "but in a poor kitchen the pot keeps honour alive." We rode in companionable silence for a while, each guarding the other's truth like a candle cupped against the wind. From time to time I looked at us from a safer distance, as if I were a passer-by with a pen. Don Quixote a land, poor hidalgo, rich in books. Sancho Panza a round peasant, rich in proverbs. One rode Rocinante as if on a line of verse. The other rode Ruccio as if on a sack of potatoes. Both moved along the pale road, and our shadows overlapped like halves of a single rope. Seen that way, I understood my task, to be the anchor that keeps the rope from flying loose in a gust. Without an anchor, the first wind of illusion can sweep a man and his servant clean off the map. There were bends where I almost faced home. The houses behind us shrank to matchboxes, the chimney smoke stitched thin black seams into the sky. Teresa would be laying the table. Sanchica would be comparing spoons with a neighbor's child. In a poor life, a good day is porridge that does not scorch, and a patch of shade at noon. Yet rest too long on one mat, and it sinks at the familiar place. To rise becomes harder than to sit. I told myself, go a little farther. If nonsense grows too tall, turn around. Every poor man owes his dream at least the distance of one honest day. Near midday we stopped by a brick kiln. The stacked red bricks looked like ranks of hopes waiting for fire. Don Quixote produced a quill and a crumpled scrap and wrote a small credo. Defend the weak, honor truth, keep one's heart clean. I asked, and bread and shirts. Bread follows honor, he said. I thought, at my house, if bread follows, the belly complains before the sermon ends, but each heart keeps its own calendar. I poured wine, broke bread, cut cheese. The stiff talk softened, as it often does when the table is set. That is a servant's trick. Learn it honestly. When ideals harden, serve lunch. Another trusty nail to hang the scene on. He told me he named his horse Rocinante because once the creature was a common hack, and now it should be first among horses. A name fattens no rib, yet it steadies a spine. I patted Ruccio and whispered, "You are first among my donkeys." Ruccio replied with the blink that is a donkey's gospel and went on chewing. There is much to love in humble beasts. They hear without arguing and accept us with our dreams and our mud. For the record, a man could learn good manners from a patient donkey. I have seen magistrates with less grace. Toward evening we caught sight of an inn. A castle, Don Quixote said, pleased, and I did not contradict him. An empty stomach will knight any inn, provided the kitchen tells the truth. The innkeeper smiled more than he spoke, and brought out a pot whose steam smelled of thyme. We ate, and my heart remembered how to settle. I nudged my master about paying. Money, he replied, is the test given to other men's fairness. The grain seller at our market keeps a scale that trembles when you add 2 kernels. To weigh justice is harder than to weigh barley, yet if we refuse to try, the beam will rust. That night on straw I listened to Rocinante breathe like a bellows. Don Quixote lay awake and spoke of the 2 things a knight must guard, his honor and his promises. He repeated the island for me, and because I was tired, I promised to rise early and tighten the girths. A servant's small promise is the peg you drive into the ground to keep a noble promise from drifting. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, sorcerers or giants, as he liked to say. I knew only that the sun would rise and that bread left uncovered grows hard before it grows wise. If you ask whether I was afraid, I confess I was. I fear hunger. I fear laughter pointed at my back. I fear the shame of returning with my eyes on the dust. Yet tucked inside, fear is a quiet courage, the kind a mother uses to carry a child across a puddle. No one sings of it, but supper stays warm. That is how I followed Don Quixote without trumpet, with enough heart to reach the next morning. When the candles were pinched out, I folded my blanket, listened to the night settle on the thatch, and told myself, one more day forward and we shall see whether the world opens another inch. And before sleep found me, I set the wineskin against my chest, as if cradling a small faith. Don Quixote already dreamed, his lips moving with an oath like a child's prayer. My fingers touched the saddle and considered the island. Perhaps it lies with palms and sand. Perhaps it is only a new way of judging what already is. He may have promised me a shore. Life may grant me a pair of eyes. Either way, I had unlatched my gate. Every journey begins with one step, one promise, and a modest courage that is content to carry the night on its back. but we still wonder whether a promise can be both a lantern to guide us and a net that catches the wind. And to loosen the cord one last time before sleep, think of how we all carry our own islands, a raise promised by a boss with soft hands, a trip saved for in a jar, the hope of a kinder neighbor. Some islands are maps, some are mirrors. If they teach us to stand straighter and to treat the next soul fairly, perhaps they are already land enough. If not, there is always bread, wine, and a donkey who knows the road home. Morning broke in the yard like a jug tapped gently on a tabletop, no spill, only the sound. I woke to Rocinante shaking straw from his mane, and to my master speaking toward the rafters, as if the air were a herald. Don Quixote had slept scarcely a thumb's width, for he had business most serious. He must be dubbed a knight. The inn which he named a castle would serve for a throne room. The innkeeper, a man whose eyes were taught to weigh purses rather than souls, caught the glint in my master's gaze, and, being wise in the trades of both wine and theatre, bowed with the ceremony of a steward. He asked whether Don Quixote had money or shirts. Knights errant carry neither, my master answered, for their fame is their coin, and their skins their linen. My stomach dropped like a bucket into a dry well. I had bread and wine, true, but no coin for the reckoning. The innkeeper shrugged the way a miller does when the wind falls. We can wait, perhaps the wind will rise. For now, the ritual first. Don Quixote insisted on a vigil over his arms, as the books prescribe. The innkeeper pointed to the well trough in the yard and said that, of all altars, this one kept the freshest water. So there he stood, helmet on, breastplate buckled, lance upright, his armour piled in a devout heap upon the trough as if it were a reliquary. I wanted sleep. Instead, I watched the doorway like a dog minding a field. 2 girls who worked there came out with ribbons in their hair, kind mouths under their laughter. They giggled at my master's grave posture, but when he spoke to them of virtue and service, their laughter thinned to a respectful thread. I have learned that even mockery grows polite before a sincere hunger. Faith, like a beggar with clean hands, can shame a full table. Midnight peeled itself from the rafters. A muleteer led his beasts to drink and put his hands on the heap of armour. Don Quixote, believing sacred law addressed him, lifted his lance and tapped the man sharply on the shoulder, not to maim, only to instruct. There was cursing, a clatter of buckets, a wet slap of tail against wood. The muleteer fled with more water on his boots than in his bucket. Another tried, another learned. The innkeeper, fearing further dents in customer or furniture, pled with my master to keep the peace. Don Quixote agreed at once, provided no one profaned the holy arms. Thus was order restored beside the most reverent trough in La Mancha, a detail fit to nail into the record. The innkeeper counselled my master, like a father advising a son, that henceforth he should carry money and clean shirts, for adventures are best endured with coin. Don Quixote agreed with the cheerfulness of a man promised a wind that will always rise. I, who keep accounts in the ledger of appetite, pledged to pack both if we could obtain them without selling the donkey's shadow. The vigil ended, the knighting began. The innkeeper produced a ledger in place of a missal, set my master in the yard between 2 candles, and bid the girls newly promoted to ladies of the castle to gird on the sword and to touch the shoulder with a palm that trembled only a little. Permit me one small, faithful quotation within fair use and good memory. The innkeeper murmured that from this hour Don Quixote must defend the weak, punish the wicked, and pursue the adventures that fortune offers in the manner of knights errant. My master's eyes brightened. He swore to serve Dulcinea and to honour the code. The yard, which earlier had smelled of beasts and cabbage, now felt like a chapel borrowed for a moment by saints and thieves alike. I confess I stood straighter than my years required. Perhaps you think I disapproved. I will not pretend otherwise. I worried about the bill, about Ruccio's tether, about the way the ceremony leaned on borrowed candles and a ledger that knew our names only for what we owed. Yet I felt an odd tenderness for the whole contraption. A baker coaxes a loaf to rise by warming the bowl with his hands. That night every palm in the yard innkeeper, girls, muleteers, and one sleepless squire warmed the bowl around my master's faith. If that is foolishness, it is the kind that makes a man try again tomorrow. At first light, we ate quickly. The stew had crisped to a brown lace where it met the pot proof that the cook respected time. I reminded Don Quixote that money would be asked of us. He replied, with a calm that could steady a ladder, that the laws of chivalry did not require payment when the cause was noble. The innkeeper, who believed in the laws of arithmetic, disagreed. There followed negotiations that stretched like cheese on a hot, knife long, a little ridiculous, but not without flavour. I bartered labour for lenience, promised to mend a fence gate, and told 3 jokes fit for a Sunday bench. In the end, the innkeeper took less than he wanted and more than we had, which is to say, he took our thanks and a pledge to pay on our return. Rare is the man who can spend a pledge. Rarer still is the man who forgets one. On the road, a new thing happened. Don Quixote rode differently, straighter, yes, but also gentler, as if the sword at his side had weight he wished to bear honestly. He spoke less of sorcerers and more of duties. He asked whether, when I governed my island, I would be merciful and exact. I said I would be like a good scalesman, wipe the dust from the pans before weighing a man's case. He liked that. We passed vineyards where the leaves had turned the colour of pennies. A shepherd raised his cap as if the day itself deserved it. For a moment we were 3-man, squire and silence, each of us saddled by a different hope. I must confess a private calculation. When I packed the wineskin and the cheese, I also packed a small habit, to say yes in public and measure later in private. It is not deceit, it is how a poor man keeps peace with hope and hunger at the same table. If you cannot afford a full candle, you burn 2 half candles on different nights, and tell yourself, the light is the same, is it? Maybe not, but the book of the heart is not audited by accountants. And sometimes mercy makes a better clerk than accuracy. Allow me to loosen the strap of our tale for a breath or two. Think of the household broom. It knows all our corners but asks for little, only to be shaken now and then in the yard. Dreams are like that. Use them daily, shake them in honest air, and they will go on sweeping. Leave them standing in a damp corner, and they mildew into superstition. Or think of the village bench. It holds the lovers on Sunday and the weary on market day. A single plank does both, if you sit kindly upon it. So too with honour and supper. The same table may serve each if you bless the bread before you break it. Around noon we met a tinker carrying hanging pots that sounded like a timid band. Don Quixote hailed him as a purveyor of alms, and the man wisely bowed to the title. A sale is a sale. My master lifted a basin with the joy of one who can see a crown where others see a soup bowl. I saw a price I could not pay. We moved on with thanks. Behind us, the tinker hummed. Ahead, a field unrolled the language of wind, and far off the sky wrote a riddle in white arms, turning though we were not yet close enough to read it. Permit me a moment of third-person honesty. Sancho Panza, the narrator might say, desired 2 contradictory things, to guard his master's dignity and to guard their dinner. This is not such a rare division. Any father who has stood between a child's school fee and a leaky roof knows the arithmetic. The sums rarely balance. You keep them walking by taking turns leaning. As the day lowered, Don Quixote instructed me how a knight should treat inns, merchants, friars, ladies, and farmers, with courtesy, with patience, with courage, with fairness, and with a tongue bridled against rashness. I thought of my neighbour Pedro, who cheats the measure when he is angry, and squares it when he is happy. Why wait for happiness? Square it always, then your anger will tire sooner. My master nodded, pleased, as if I had quoted a book without knowing it. That is his gift to me. To make my plain sense feel like a page rescued from a library. We camped by a low hedge. Ruccio, philosopher of hay, arranged his legs and made his argument for the world by falling asleep at once. Don Quixote prayed to his lady and to the code he served. I checked my knots, counted our bread, and kept one ear open for trouble. The last thing I heard before sleep was my master whispering that tomorrow we would seek giants or remedies for the oppressed, whichever came first. I smiled in the dark. Tomorrow often brings neither giants nor remedies. It brings fences to climb and neighbors to greet, which are adventures enough for those who pay attention. But we still wonder whether a ceremony built from kindness and pretense can carry a man as far as one built from iron and taxes. I have seen weak bridges hold because the village crossed them together, and strong ones fail because no one trusted them. Perhaps that is the measure, not the cost of the stone, but the weight of the hearts that step upon it. Before the stars close their shop, I promise myself two things: to keep our purse from becoming a sermon, and our sermons from becoming a purse. If I manage that balance, the island, whatever shape it takes, will not shame me when it arrives or when it does not. For now the road is enough. It has room for a knight's shadow and a donkey's patience, and for a squire learning, step by steady step, to see with both the eyes of justice and the eyes that find the inn before night. It was one of those afternoons when La Mancha spreads itself like a pale tablecloth and invites the wind to supper. The road took a mild turn, the field stepped down toward a shallow valley, and there, proud as lords who owned the horizon, stood 30 or 40 windmills, their long arms turning with a ceremony of their own. I have seen them all my life. Their creak is part of the village alphabet. Yet when Don Quixote saw them, he lifted himself in the saddle as if the world had sent him a letter at last. Fortune, he said, guides our affairs better than we know. Look there, friend Sancho, where giants with long arms present themselves. The wind at that moment pushed a sail so that it stretched like a monk's sleeve. I followed his finger, followed his faith, and still saw only flower and gears dressed as clouds. Giants? I said. Those are not giants, but windmills, and what appear to be arms are their sails, which, when turned by the wind, spin the millstone. I swear to you, I said it as plainly as soup names its ingredients. He turned to me with kindness that bit like pepper. It is easy to see, he answered, that you are not practiced in the matter of adventures. These are giants. His voice did not shout. It rested on the word giants, as a hand rests on a table before standing. He lowered the visor with a click that sounded like the period at the end of a prayer, set spurs to Rocinante, and charged. I would like to tell you that at such moments a squire knows what to do. It would be a noble lie. The mind splits like a plank under too much weight. One half runs after the master, the other half begs the legs to stay. I did as most honest men do, I shouted warnings and rode after him anyway. "Take care, sir," I cried. "It is the wind." The wind, alas, did not take care. It blew with the indifference of all elements toward human oaths. Allow me to fix one faithful nail from the original story upon this plank. Don Quixote lowered his lance and took aim at the nearest mill, just as a gust caught the sail. The sail swung, seized the lance, and broke it to splinters, and horse and rider rolled in the stubble, in a confusion of armor and ambition. The sound the world made was not cruel. It was the sound a cupboard makes when you close it too hard, a scold, and then silence. I was beside him at once. Rocinante snorted a theology of dust. Don Quixote tried to rise and could not. The helmet yawned to one side like a jar's crooked lid. "Did I not warn you?" I said, which is the least helpful sentence a friend can bring to an accident. He waved me off with a patience I have admired at better times. "Peace, Sancho," he said. "It seems that the enchanter, Freston, who robbed me of my library, has turned these giants into windmills to deny me glory. There are moments when a man must choose mercy over sense. I had 2 lines ready, one from sight, one from love. Sight would have me insult the wind and call it friend of sorcery. Love would let the wind be wind and the man keep his hope. I chose love." "Then Freston works fast," I said. I thought he needed more time to read the weather. We took stock. The lance had died an honourable death. My master's shoulder sang with bruises, but no ballads of broken bones. Rocinante limped like a veteran returned to his stool. Don Quixote asked me to help remove the helmet, which had learned to cling to the head more intimately than any hat should. When it came off, his face shone with that contrarian light, half pain, half gratitude that I have seen in men who lose a game and still find a principle polished by the loss. He asked me to fetch a branch of oak. With my knife we fashioned a new lance as straight as circumstances allow. He kissed the wood, a bishop blessing a staff. He offered me, in that battered hour, a lecture on fortune. "Adventures," he said, "are of 2 kinds, those that raise a man and those that test whether the raising was worth the effort." I countered with a proverb about bread. The first loaf teaches a baker humility, the second teaches him patience, the third buys him salt. "Then we are at the second loaf," he replied. I could not deny it. Our salt remained in the pouch of the future. Permit me a return to the scene as any honest witness would paint it. The sky had that look blue, not proud of it. The hill, dry but not cruel. The windmills, having no tongues, said nothing about what we had done to their sails. They turned, because they must, and carried the day toward evening. In such a theatre, the difference between tragedy and comedy is the price of the ticket and the softness of the straw we fall on. We paid little and fell on stubble, not a bad bargain, all told. You might ask what I felt as I helped him to his feet. Embarrassment, a small coin that buys silence in a crowd. Affection, which is a larger coin but spends itself quickly if you flaunt it. And a third thing, call it apprenticeship. Each time I see Don Quixote name the world, and the world refuse to answer to that name, I learn how stubborn both sides can be. It is useful knowledge for a man who hopes to govern an island, or at least a kitchen. If you allow me 2 breaths of levity to loosen the belt of the tale. Once, in our village, a mason tried to court a widow by calling her a cathedral. She married a potter who called her by her given name and brought her broth when she coughed. Words matter, so do bowls. And again, a boy once fought the shadow of a tree at noon and returned with a twig for a sword. His grandfather taught him to fight the shade at evening when it is longer and easier to humble. Timing, I am learning, is as noble as courage. Should I have tied the reins and stood before the mill like a living fence? Perhaps, but I have learned that a man's delusion, if entered roughly, bruises into stubbornness. If entered gently, it sometimes blooms into recognition. So I fetched the wine and we shared it, each sipping what the day had not stolen. He told me how giants' arms can crush towns. I told him how sails crush grain into flour, so a town may eat. We looked from his story to mine, from danger to dinner. And somehow, both were true enough to live by until sundown. We resumed the road when the light softened. Behind us, one sail creaked in a tone that sounded almost like a benediction. Don Quixote thanked Dulcinea for her invisible favor. I thanked the stable boy who had once taught me how to jump clear of a falling mule. It is well to have many saints. Let the heavens sort the hierarchy. A passing shepherd stopped to listen and then walked on, shaking his head with that country charity which says, "I have seen worse." The sheep scattered a little at Rocinante's step. Ruccio, diplomat and friend to all, persuaded them with a snuff that the world was safe. I imagined telling Teresa about the day. She would lower the spoon, look toward the window and say, "Windmills again." There is comfort in a wife who has one word for many disasters. When we made camp, Don Quixote asked me to repeat my certainty about the mills. I did, gently, as a man repeats to a child the shape of the moon. He listened, then placed his hand on my shoulder. "Sancho, if they were mills, then I erred bravely. And if they were giants," I said, "they have the best disguises in Castile." He laughed in that sober way of his, which is laughter borrowed from tomorrow. But we still wonder whether the courage that misnames a thing is better or worse than the caution that names it correctly and does nothing. A heart might break its lance against a sail, a head might save its hat and lose its story. Which poverty is graver? Before sleep, I rehearsed the island in my mind, not for its palms, but for its judgments. If a man brought me a case of a mill that looked like a giant to him, would I punish him for charging or praise him for confessing? I think I would do as Teresa does with soup. Skim the foam first, serve the broth after, leave the scum of foolishness aside, feed the courage beneath. Tomorrow will bring more names for the same wind. If we are lucky, we will learn to mill it into bread before it mills us into dust. As the stars set their quiet teeth in the dark, I tied our new lance to the pack and promised to mend the day's tear with better thread. Don Quixote slept with one hand on the hilt and the other open, as if holding an invisible rein. I pulled my blanket, thanked the wind for not remembering, and let the hush settle. In the night's ledger, I wrote a small line. Paid with splinters, received instruction. Toward noon, the sky tried on a grey hat, the kind a cautious man wears before rain decides itself. We had left the mills behind, and with them a handful of splinters and a fistful of lessons. The road now ran between low hills that looked like folded cloaks, and a thin stream practiced speaking in pebbles. Down that same road, across the shallow murmur of water, came a rider who had taken a shortcut through the brook. He was a barber, though we did not know it at the first blink, and here is the faithful detail your memory may already cherish. He wore upon his head a gleaming brass basin tilted like a crown. He had set it there, as barbers do, to save it from the water, rain threatened, and brass keeps a better shine when it is not asked to drink. Don Quixote drew up as if a herald had blown a silver horn in his ear. "Sancho," he said, voice low with that double gravity he reserves for destiny and soup, "behold him who bears the helmet of Mambrino. I, whose life has been instructed by kitchens and fields, saw only a tradesman protecting his property from the weather." "Sir," I ventured, "what your worship takes for enchanted steel is a basin, and what you call a Moorish king's relic is a barber's livelihood." He turned to me with a priest's patience. "It is plain, friend Sancho, that you are not acquainted with adventures. This is Mambrino's helm. The enchanters, out of envy, have changed it into a basin so that it may not add to my glory. Enchanters, in our house we have simpler words: weather, luck, and the price of wheat. Yet envy plays its tricks among mortals and gods." I felt the old tug in two directions. The truth, as my eyes dressed it, and the truth, as his heart clothed it. Before I could choose a coat, Don Quixote lowered his visor, put heels to Rocinante, and crossed the brook with a splash that baptized the moment. The barber, poor soul, saw the charge, dropped his reins, and turned his mule so quickly that he almost left his body behind. He flew from the saddle like a scarf from a window, and off he ran, bareheaded, his hands up to feel whether his ears remained. The basin fell with a courteous ring and lay shining on the stones, a sun in a puddle. "Victory, Sancho!" cried my master, and he dismounted to lift the prize. He weighed it, considered its brim, and fitted it to his brow. The basin, being bred to humbler service, would not obey the geometry of his temples. It perched like a saucer on a jar. He did not blink. "It lacks the half-beaver," he said. "But I remember reading that this very helm had its lower part shorn away in some past encounter. No matter, the excellence of its metal surpasses the defect of its fashion." He turned it in his hands. My face reflected in it as round and frank as any village moon. Here I had a choice. I could laugh. There are laughs that do not insult and earn a bruise to my dignity for the price of honesty. Or I could help the world become, if only for an hour, what he believed it. I chose help. "A fine piece," I said, "fit for a head that bows to none but a lady." He nodded and asked me to fetch the pack-saddle the barber had left behind, which he fancied a noble crupper for Rocinante. I bit my tongue. A donkey's furniture does not gain nobility because a noble names it, though I admit the naming makes the twilight warmer. Permit me to fasten a faithful nail from the original tale. Don Quixote declared the basin the helmet of the famed Mambrino, and when I murmured about its barber's trade, he answered that the enchanters who persecute me have transformed it by their art into what you see. I have heard many excuses from farmers late to market and husbands late to supper. None have been so dignified. I set the basin across my saddle-bow and felt its practical promise. If not for a helmet, I thought, it will serve us to water the beasts. We rested under a holm oak whose leaves whispered, as such leaves do, about everything and nothing. Don Quixote polished the basin with the corner of his cloak until it shone well enough to blind a cautious man. He spoke of Mambrino, a Saracen king whose helmet rendered its wearer invulnerable, so the books swear by their margins. I spoke of our Teresa, who keeps a cracked jug that she calls the good jar because it has never betrayed the taste of water. "Names, sir," I said, "sometimes keep courage hot, like a lid keeps a pot lively." He smiled. "And sometimes," he said, Names wake a sleeping pot. Allow me to loosen the belt of the story with two homely truths. First, in our village, a neighbour once painted the rim of his only cup with a ring of cheap gold leaf. He said the wine tasted better. When the leaf wore off, the wine tasted the same, but he had learned to savour. Second, a child I know wears his father's cap when he fetches wood. He says the path straightens beneath him. The path is unchanged. The boy is taller. If that is deception, it is one that carries logs to the hearth and harms no one but Winter. We set the basin upon Rocinante again, this time tilting it so that its brim mimicked a visor. Don Quixote regarded his reflection, which curved handsomely along the brass, and made him look both distant and near, like a candle seen in a spoon. Enchanters may disguise metal, he said, but they cannot unmake valor. I wanted to answer with another proverb about stew-how. Even poor meat grows proud when garlic is kind, but I kept it for later. Some compliments earn interest when allowed to rest. As we were thus arranging empire on a donkey's salary, two travellers approached, one carrying shears, and the other a tin case of ointments. They stared at the basin with the special look that owners reserve for their property when they find it on a stranger's head. Words were exchanged, mine soft, theirs sharp. Don Quixote's noble. I declared that this basin had been won in fair encounter, and was now furniture of chivalry. They weighed our armour with their eyes, weighed our confidence with their fear, and decided to sell us peace cheaply. "Keep it," the barber said finally, hands raised to the weather. "The rain will make me a new one." I thanked him with a seriousness that surprised even me. Later, when the road forgot their footsteps, Don Quixote instructed me in the ethics of spoils. "What is gained in just battle," he said, "belongs by right to the victorious, unless it be an heirloom returned for love." "Then this," I replied, tapping the basin, "is ours by the law of courage and the mercy of its former master." He chuckled. Mercy had taken the shape of prudence, but I did not press the matter. The world often wraps wisdom in whichever paper keeps the rain out. We dined on bread gentle with yesterday's stew, and shared a ribbon of wine that remembered the grape. Don Quixote balanced the basin on his knee while he ate, as if keeping a truce between hunger and honor. I tried it on my own head. It slid down to my ears and made the world sound like a drum with a pillow inside. We laughed. I admit it, the laugh did not hurt truth. It simply gave truth a chair to sit on. As twilight stitched the hills together, my master spoke tenderly of Dulcinea, and promised that when she saw him crowned with Mambrino's helm, she would grant him a glance capable of curing any bruise. I thought of Teresa's glances, which cure by telling you you are still yourself, even when your hat is ridiculous. Between ladies and wives, I said, the world learns to walk. He agreed an agreement that sat so sweetly between us that, for a moment, every fiction felt like a path to a better fact. But we still wonder whether calling a basin a helmet makes us braver or merely blind. If a noble lie carries a weary man one hill farther toward mercy, is it less noble if a plain truth reduces a friend to ridicule and robs him of the strength to act kindly tomorrow? Is it sufficiently true? Between the accurate name and the helpful name runs a narrow causeway. A donkey can cross it, so can a man if he minds his step. Before sleep, I hung the basin where I could see it glimmer in the last light. A small moon caught in a branch. I told myself it was both things at once, the barber's livelihood and my master's glory, our water bowl and his helm. The world, when it is generous, allows two meanings to sit at the same table without breaking the bread. I promised to keep the brass bright, not only for the rain, but also for the courage that, foolish or not, keeps two poor travellers moving toward a horizon they hope to deserve. By mid-afternoon the plain put on its summer shimmer, so that distances looked like thoughts the sun had not finished thinking. Far ahead a low dust began to write itself across the road, and from that pale handwriting there came a horn's bleat, not the silver trumpet of a court, but the long, homely call by which shepherds persuade their scattered charges into a single sentence. To my ears it said, grass, the way a baker's whistle says bread. To Don Quixote's ears it said battle. Providence, Sancho, he murmured, drawing rein, has set before us two mighty armies. He lifted his hand like a tutor unrolling a chart. On the right march the troops of Alifanfaron, infidel king of Taprobana. On the left the noble host of Pentapolin of the rolled-up sleeve, who fights beneath the banner of the cross. If you had seen his face, then serious as a judge, and lighted like an altar, you might have believed the dust was a tapestry and the horn a choir. I squinted until the world behaved and gave me sheep. Tight bundles of white and brown, each with a mind enough to follow the tale before it. A shepherd at each flank, a boy hurrying the laggards by dragging a branch that wrote no letters any sheep could read. "Sir," I said, keeping my tone respectful as a man speaks to a thunderstorm, "those banners are clouds, and these are not armies but flocks. The horns are not to signal a charge, they are to convince a ram that he is a citizen." He smiled with that peppered kindness of his. "Sancho, your conversation with inns and kitchens has not educated your eye for adventures. The enchanters who persecute me often conceal the truth beneath rustic garments. Attend closely. See there the mighty standard-bearers, hear the drums." At that very moment the horn went again, long and mournful, like a pot left to sigh on the fire. "There is your drum," I said. "It wears a reed for a skin." He lowered his visor. Rocinante's ears twitched into attention. "Stay, if you fear," he added gently. "I fear many things." "Empty pots," loud laughter behind my back. "The price of wheat when the sky lies to the fields, but I am not good at staying when a friend rides away." "I will stand aside," I said, "the better to witness your glory." And then I nudged Ruccio just enough to keep folly within reach. What followed is a fact as firm as a fence post. Don Quixote charged lance-level, words, flying names of dukes, oaths to Dulcinea, prayers to saints who by long habit bless both soup and swords. He plunged straight into the first flock, which is a strategy that convinces sheep but not shepherds. They cried out men, not sheep, and one snatched up a sling from his belt, a tool as old and honest as bread. Another did the same. The air learned a fast new language. A stone struck my master's shoulder so soundly that the armor rang like a bell, waking the drowsy. Another kissed his jaw, and I saw the mouth twist. Not so much from pain as from insult. He kept his seat like a prayer, stubbornly staying in a cold church. "Back!" I shouted. "They will break you for a wolf." But he pressed on, scattering sheep, which is a feat that proves little to history and much to wool. I reached him just as a third stone argued with his helmet and won. He toppled into the thistles. Rocinante, gentleman among horses, folding himself carefully so as not to crush hope more than necessary. The shepherds advanced, slings cocked, anger taut, I raised both hands and bellowed the dialect that all men speak when their supper depends on it. Peace! The gentleman is sick with chivalry. That unusual diagnosis, coupled with my sincere hat in hand, earned us a reprieve. A shepherd, seeing no blood but much confusion, spat near my boot in lieu of worse punishment and drove his flock on with professional contempt. The horn went again, this time with a note that suggested the day had errands to finish. Don Quixote sat up slowly. Dust had painted a second face upon his own. The visor hung like a broken eyelid. His lance was now a broomstick, with ambitions. I offered water. He waved it away, then accepted, then drank as a man honors a treaty. "You saw them, Sancho," he said between breaths. "You saw how Freston, that eternal thief of my glory, changed the warriors, at the very moment of their defeat, into sheep." I confess that the bars still visible on the horizon struggled to resemble cavalry, yet love has its own arithmetic. I did not subtract his honor with the blunt instrument of my eyesight. "I saw dust," I answered, "and men who mistook a knight for a wolf. But if enchanters meddled, they are quick with their hands." I held up a tuft of wool my lance had gathered when it passed too near a lamb. "A trophy," I said, "from the beard of Alifanfaron." He smiled sideways, the expression of a man who knows grace when it is offered and will not embarrass it by naming it charity. Let us nail in one faithful detail. For the benefit of those who study the ledger of truth. In the original history, the shepherd's stones knocked out some of the teeth from the poor knight's mouth. I will not dwell on that. I am a friend to dinners, not to dentists. I will say only that evening, my master's smile measured one tooth fewer of confidence and 2 measures more of determination. He requested that I remind him to compound the balsam of Fierabras at our next opportunity, for slings, he observed with philosophy, are proofs that the age of giants is not wholly past. I promised, though my stomach remembered what his potion does to it and begged me to lose the recipe. We withdrew to the shade of a tamarisk where the dust settled like a clerk tired of adding columns. Don Quixote contrived to polish the basin of Mambrino or basin, that is, in order to recrown dignity. I, preferring function to coronation, bent its rim a little so it would better seat on his head and better hold water for Rocinante. "Look," I said, "a miracle that needs no wizard, a helmet that is both honor and bucket." He laughed, and the laugh held no splinters. To ease the sting, allow me 2 crumbs of village wit. First, once, our neighbor Diego bet everything on a rooster rumored to crow at dawn louder than the church bell. The bird crowed politely, the bell did its job. Diego now studies wheat prices with a humility fit for monks. Second, a tailor in our town stitched the richest words into a poor man's wedding coat glory, fortune. Ever after, but the only word that wore well was mended, which his wife added, needle in hand, when the sleeve caught on a nail. Some truths are quieter than trumpets, they last longer. Late sun made honest shapes of everything. Don Quixote rehearsed for me the names of the generals I had failed to recognize. Captains with beards like standards, a duke whose horse wore shoes of silver, a company of archers whose arrows hum hymns. He told it so well that, for a breath, I heard a true trumpet lean from the horizon. Then the wind turned, and the sound belonged again to horn and reed. "You see?" I said gently. "I see," he answered, and then, with that obstinate mercy of his, "And yet, Sancho, I also see what the world refuses to admit until a knight compels it." We inventoried damages, a bruise purpling like a plum, a helmet needing the persuasive logic of my knee. A lance to be made new from the next straight branch the world offered. We inventoried gains, a handful of wool for a pillow, a story for Teresa that would not shame our supper, and one more lesson in the dialect of motive, how men can make the same dust mean war or weather, depending on the ache in their hearts. That night, by a small fire that practiced moderation, I tried words the size of my mouth. "My master," I said, "if a man calls his fear by a brave name, does the fear grow smaller or merely change its hat?" He turned the basin in his hands so that the fire wrote our faces in copper. "Names are oars," he said. "They do not change the river, but they decide how we cross it." I considered this and added a peasant's footnote. "Then let us also learn to swim." But we still wonder whether the heart that hears trumpets where only horns blow is a danger to bread or a servant to hope. If it wastes a man against stones, it is costly. If it teaches the timid to stand by the weak, it is dear in another coin. Perhaps wisdom is not to silence one ear or the other, but to braid them to keep a little trumpet for courage and a little horn for pasture, so that neither dinner nor dignity starves. When sleep at last took up its post, I lay with my hand on Ruccio's warm neck and imagined Sierra Morena dark against the moon, where we would soon learn what letters a forest writes to those who stray into it with too much faith or not enough. Don Quixote, already visiting Dulcinea in a dream generous enough to seat 2 doubts and a promise, breathed evenly. I pulled my blanket to the chin and told the night my quiet vow. Tomorrow, if the world sends us armies, I will pack water. If it sends us sheep, I will pack patience. Either way, I will keep one eye on the road and one on the pot, so that our story may feed more than fame when we carry it home. Sierra Morena rose ahead of us like a dark psalm stanzas of cork, oak and stone, goats writing their footnotes along the ledges. We had left behind the dust, the horn, and the hard grammar of slings. Don Quixote's face, thinner by a tooth and richer by resolve, looked east with the steadiness of a man who had decided what kind of sorrow would educate his courage. "Here," he said, reining in where the mountain laid a hand upon the road, "I shall do penance in imitation of Amadis of Gaul when he called himself Beltenebros, the Darkened One." You see, he chose sorrow not because Dulcinea had refused him, but because, according to the books, great love asks for great gestures, whether the world notices or not. Some men wait for life to give them a cause. My master sometimes makes one, so his heart has work. He bid me unfold our poor writing kit. There, on a page's worth of patience, he composed a letter to Dulcinea del Toboso. Allow me a sliver within fair use and faithful memory. He addressed her as sovereign lady, confessed himself wounded unto death by love, and promised that deeds would follow words, as thunder follows a serious cloud. He sealed it with a cross and a flourish that nearly spent our ink. He placed it in my hands as a father might pass a ring to a son, more trust than gold. "Sancho," he said, "you will ride to El Toboso, deliver this, and return with her command. If she bids me die, I will obey. If she bids me live, I shall live in her service." His voice did not tremble. Mine did, a little, on behalf of dinner. I tucked the letter under my shirt, where a peasant keeps the day's safest truth. He then proposed to perform certain acts of penance within decency, I assure you, and within the patience of an honest squire. He removed his outer garments to the degree the mountains could forgive and the story could keep its manners, then rolled upon the grass, then leaped in place as if testing whether earth still loved him, then stood, motionless, arms crossed like a bridge, whispering Dulcinea's name with a tenderness that made the oaks reconsider their age. I turned my back when courtesy asked, and watched for snakes when loyalty asked, which is to say, I practiced the double art of friendship. If you wish for a faithful nail from the old history, Don Quixote vowed to imitate Amadis's penance without the cause, declaring that a knight's greatness is measured as much by his readiness for pain as by the pain itself. I, who have a simpler measure how far a loaf stretches and how well a rope holds, counselled moderation. "Sir," I said, "even saints eat." He smiled, reached for the basin of Membrinor basin, and instructed that I leave it where rain might test its future as both helm and bowl. "A helm must learn to keep a man dry," he said, "and a bowl must learn to hold his thirst." Sometimes his sayings arrive dressed in nonsense and undress into wisdom while you are looking. Then he put into my care the remainder of our bread and 2 figs, made the sign of the cross over both of us and over the valley, and sent me toward Toboso. I set out upon Ruccio, whispering to my donkey that he would soon see streets, again familiar stones that remember hooves, and perhaps a chicken who did not yet suspect its destiny. Yet my road bent not to Toboso, but to an inn, for I am Sancho, and know that errands often pass through bread before they pass through truth. This was, in fact, the same inn which my master had promoted to a castle, and there I found 2 friends of our village, the priest and the barber, not the poor barber of the basin, mind you, but our own, the one who shears sermons thinner than wool when he has time. They received me with the particular hospitality reserved for news. I told them that Don Quixote was doing penance for reasons that literature understands, and that I bore a letter to Dulcinea which the saints themselves might hesitate to deliver. Seeing their concern ripen into scheme, they swore we would bring him home by craft, gentler than force. But first, the priest said, "Eat." I obeyed with a loyalty worthy of a knight's table. Between mouthfuls I confessed the difficulty that lay between Dulcinea, the lady of my master's worship, and Aldonza Lorenzo, the sturdy, decent girl of Toboso, who knows the weight of a sack of wheat and the value of a clean pail. Love renames, the village keeps the ledger. I am a man with 2 pockets and not enough coins for both. The priest advised me softly, as one might advise a hen about foxes, that I need not literally place the letter in Aldonza's hands that night. "Carry back a word, Sancho," he said, "and we shall contrive the rest." The barber nodded as men nod when they have just sharpened an idea. I slept on it, which is the squire's courtroom. By morning I had decided to do a small mercy that would cost me a truth and save my master a heart. I would tell him I had spoken with Dulcinea, and that she sent a look heavy with favour, the kind that turns straw into a mattress. I turned back towards Sierra Morena with a message I had made, light as a lie, and I hoped, strong as a kindness. On the way I thought of the island he had promised and the judgments I would one day deliver. Judge fairly, Sancho, which is crueler to disappoint a noble dream with a fact, or to strengthen a noble deed with a fiction that harms no one? In the village, we sometimes salt a tough stew with a story, so the children swallow supper and sleep. Is that fraud, or is it a recipe the poor have earned? I found Don Quixote beneath a cork tree, carving his name upon the bark as men do when they wish the world to remember what their mouths cannot finish saying. He had wrapped himself again in decency and devotion, the twin cloaks of his station. I delivered my report with the practiced plainness of a man who has told market prices for years. "Sir," I said, "I reached El Toboso and saw Dulcinea at her gate. She smelled of honest effort and wheat after rain. She bade me tell your worship to continue your great deeds, for she holds you in a singular esteem, and reserves for you a reward fitted to your merits." I added, because even a lie should wear a little truth, that she had laughed once a low, hearty laugh, and that it made the afternoon feel taller. He looked at me as a man looks at a cup, and wonders whether it holds wine or a miracle. Then he wept briefly and without shame, the way a field drinks when a cloud is modest. He called me friend, which I count among the few titles to outlast crowns, and declared himself the knight of the sorrowful face, a name, he said, that my honest eyes had first suggested when they beheld his bruises and took pity. I did not argue. A man should name himself by the face he hopes to heal. He asked if I had brought a token, a glove, a ribbon, a strand of hair. I confessed that I had not, but that the look I carried was token enough to light his penance like a lamp trimmed to last the night. He accepted it, and at once swore to add to his disciplines mad acts, not out of madness, but out of method. As he put it, leaps, sighs, and sonnets, until Dulcinea's command arrived in flesh and word. I suggested the addition of soups to his regime. A man can breathe longer, I said, on love and broth combined than on either alone. He embraced the wisdom warmly, as if it had been quoted from Amadis himself. Permit me 2 crumbs of village air to soften the crust. First, once, our neighbor Quiteria sent her boy to apologize to a girl he had teased. "Say sorry with your whole face," she told him, "or don't bother the door." He did, and the girl forgave him so completely that she later married him and made him late for everything but supper. Second, a mule in our town refuses to cross a shallow stream unless you praise it in advance. Call it steady fellow, and it becomes a bridge. Words are little coins, they purchase crossings as well as bread. We agreed that I would remain nearby while he continued the penance, and that I would watch the road for tidings or for the priest and barber, whom I hoped would bring a plan folded smaller than a quarrel. Don Quixote climbed a small rise and recited something half prayer, half poem, addressed to a lady who, whether she heard or not, had succeeded at the main task of all high loves. She had improved the man who spoke. The basin winked in a patch of sun. Rocinante cropped thyme. Ruccio argued softly with a thistle, and lost. But we still wonder whether a tender invention meant to preserve a friend's hope honors truth or injures it. If it keeps a tired soul marching toward mercy and harms no neighbor's bread, perhaps it is a bridle for despair, not a mask for deceit.
Yet we must mind the habit. A man who salts every pot with fable will one day forget the taste of water. The causeway between compassion and falsehood is as narrow as a goat path. I tell you, I walk it with my hand upon the rock. That night, the mountains cooled like bread taken from the oven to a windowsill. Don Quixote slept the honest sleep of a man who believes he is doing exactly what his story requires.
I sat awake a little longer and traced, with my finger on the dirt, 2 islands. One made of land, which I may never rule. One made of judgments, which I am ruling already. Each time I tell the truth kindly or the kindness truthfully. If Dulcinea never reads her letter, still the writing has altered the writer. If my report never touched her ear, still the hope it brought has warmed one good man through a cold stretch of woods. Between such losses and gains a peasant measures riches and chooses, when he can, to be generous. By the time I came down from the stony psalms of Sierra Morena, the inn, the same one that had once knighted my master by candle, and Ledger had collected more stories than barrels. There I found our priest and our own barber, not the poor soul who lost a basin, but the shaver of our parish. And with them a young woman whose bearing made the doorway look like a frame built for her. She was Dorothea, though I learned the name after I had already believed the act, wronged in love, rich in spirit, quick in mind. When the priest whispered our plan, she lifted her chin the way a queen does when a hard road must be made to kneel. If it brings the gentleman safely home, she said, I will be a princess until truth is strong enough to remove the crown. They dressed the barber with a false beard, a reddish tuft from an ox's tail, tied with ribbon so that even his conscience would not recognize him in a glass. The priest declared himself chaplain and steward, and Dorothea, with a grace that taught the room to breathe more softly, became the Princess Micomicona, sovereign of the distant kingdom of Micomicon. Her enemy, as the books require, was a giant, Pandafilando of the scowling visage and name that frowns even when printed. I, who have played many parts at market day, customer, porter, counsellor, was given the sweetest role. Witness, it is a part for which the poor train all their lives. We set out while the day still had shine to spend. When we found Don Quixote in his hermitage of cork, oak and purpose, he had carved half a poem into the bark and was searching for the other half in the sky. Dorothea dismounted, let the reins fall like surrendered arguments, and knelt before him with the artless majesty of someone who has known real sorrow and can therefore imitate it without cheating. My lord, she said, and here I claim only the breath of fair use. I am the Princess Micomicona, stripped of my kingdom by Pandafilando, who vows to wed me by force. Only your arm, famous through many lands, can restore me to my people. The mountains themselves straightened their coats. My master, who can recognize a petition at 4 leagues by the shape despair makes on a face, lifted her with the courtliness that does not depend on rooms. Lady, he answered, I am bound to another by the name of Dulcinea, but my service is yours in all that pertains to honor and rescue. He swore upon his order to defend her, and turning to me with the old light rekindled, promised on the spot, as though fortune had finally signed its IOU, that I would be governor of an island once Micomicon was free. The word island went through me like a ladle through stew stirring up the best parts. I bowed as low as the knees of a man who must still stand can bow. I confess, even as I admired the nobility of this theatre, the truth tugged my sleeve. I knew Dorothea's real name and sorrow, knew that Pandafilando existed, for the moment, only in our mouths. Yet, if mended fabric keeps a poor man warm, shall he mock the needle? The priest gave me a look that said, Courage, Sancho. This is a merciful ruse. I returned a look that said, Make it short. Hope is heavy to carry uphill. We set the basin of Mambrino upon Don Quixote's head for ceremony's sake, tilted just so, to look more helm than Boland. He took Rocinante's reins with a solemnity that brushed the dust from the path. Dorothea rode at his side, telling the history of Micomicon as if she had been born there, which, in a manner of courage, she had. The priest kept pace, furnishing prophecies as needed. The barber stroked his ox-tail beard, a gesture that improved both his gravity and our spirits. In the rear with Ruccio, counted islands the way a child counts stalks on a roof, superstition, perhaps. But good for the neck. Let me hammer a nail of faithful detail from the old history. When the princess offered to reward her champion with herself, Don Quixote refused, declaring that his heart was occupied and that any other recompense should be directed to his squire. Whereupon, with generosity quick as a candle's answer to a match, she promised that Sancho would be made governor. I record this not to inflate my shirt, but to remind the ledger that even make-believe can practice justice when it wishes to be better than it is. The road, which had lately taught us the grammar of slings and stones, now practiced kinder conjugations: pledge, escort, believe. Don Quixote spoke of strategy, how to approach a giant of the scowling visage without provoking needless storms. Dorothea listened with a patience that made his counsels feel like furniture in a room she had always owned. I rode close enough to hear, and far enough to keep my doubts from touching the bridle. When the talk flagged, I broke the air with 3 village stitches. First, the story of a neighbour who borrowed a ladle and returned a spoon, saying the spoon had grown shy laughter helps a caravan. Second, a proverb about how a patched cloak keeps a man as warm as a regal one if he walks fast. Third, a memory of Teresa calling out that supper refuses to wait for destiny but admits the late with bread if they arrive smiling. We met a pair of muleteers who eyed our procession with the solid skepticism of men whose saints carry hayforks. "Who goes there?" one asked. "Micomicon," the priest proclaimed. The word puzzled them into respect. It is a trick older than the alphabet. Pronounce a place no one has visited, and they will step aside lest their maps be accused. The muleteers doffed caps. Our little court processed on, richer by 2 nods. In the cool of late afternoon, Dorothea told me, in the privacy between horse and donkey, a thinner truth than the one she wore. How men with power confuse wanting with deserving. How a woman can be beguiled out of her name and yet retrieve it by walking straight when the road curves. How the dignity of playing princess for a good friend could, for an hour, heal the humiliation of having been treated like a pawn. I told her that the poor also act, buyers when we are sellers, confessors when we are fools, jesters when the room needs mercy. If acting toward kindness restores reality later, I said, then the stage is an honest bridge. Toward evening we camped in a hollow where time kept the ground from forgetting its manners. Don Quixote fashioned a speech for the people of Micomicon, brave and just, whom he had not yet met, and rehearsed promises fit for a festival. Dorothea listened with wet eyes, not because she believed in the kingdom we had made of breath, but because she believed in the man who could speak so nobly to strangers. I watched him, and I watched her watching, and I felt that rare alignment when fiction and fact share one hearth. A good woman using the story to remedy a good man's story, both trying to straighten what life had left wrinkled. For a little air, allow me 2 household comparisons. First, a paper crown on a child's head will not frighten a storm, but it can persuade a timid heart to fetch wood without complaint. Second, a wooden spoon, held with ceremony, can serve as a scepter when a mother arbitrates between quarrels. The decision tastes just as fair in the soup. We do not live by iron alone. Sometimes make-believe is simply belief given a small stool to rest on. As stars began their honest labour, Don Quixote asked whether I preferred an island with oranges or one with olives. I answered, in the only statesmanlike manner a hungry man knows, both, if the soil consents. He laughed, and I stored the sound with other provisions. He then charged me to keep faith with the princess's safety and to remember that governors must be more just than jolly. I promised to mix justice with jollity as Teresa mixes garlic, with oil enough to flavour, not so much as to scald. But we still wonder whether a righteous deception a play mounted to rescue a man from his own noble excess, honors the truth by leading it home, or injures it by bending its spine. If the fraud seats kindness beside courage and costs no innocent his supper, perhaps it is not fraud but stewardship of a soul. Yet habit is a sly tailor. Wear such costumes too often, and even your mirror will forget your face. We slept with our equipment of real brass, and borrowed titles arranged between us like offerings: the basin, the lance hewn from a forgiving branch, the beard that fooled even the night, and the word island, which I set beneath my tongue like a sweet to keep me from saying anything foolish. When I closed my eyes, I saw Pandafilando shrink into the size of a bad idea, and Micomicon grow into the size of a promise kept. If we reached the inn by tomorrow, the next act of our play would begin, with tables for a stage and conscience for a curtain. We reached the inn, which my master's imagination had promoted to a castle long ago, just as the door learned to balance light and smoke in equal parts. Dorothea wore her princess with the same modesty that a good woman wears grief, nothing gaudy, nothing careless. The priest and our barber kept their roles with the gravity of men who have lied only for mercy. I, who had been promised an island, tethered Ruccio to his future and prayed that both donkey and dream would still be there after supper. Inside, the inn had grown a few new stories. Travellers were arranging their tiredness on benches. A jar of wine stood like a small moon in a corner. The landlord tallied reckonings with the stern compassion of a scale. The room welcomed our pageant the way a hearth welcomes wet woods, sputtering, then flame. Dorothea repeated her plea. The priest interlaced prophecy. Our barber stroked his ox-tail beard until even he believed himself older. Don Quixote bowed, promised deliverance from Pandafilando, and kissed the air with the courtesy he saves for Dulcinea when the distance refuses favours. Supper stitched us into a circle. My master ate like a man who has vowed to hunger if necessary, but sees no sin in postponing necessity. Dorothea listened to him compose a speech for the people of Micomicon, righteous, musical, and thoroughly portable. Sometimes he rehearses justice as if it were a song to be carried door to door. I have learned that songs and justice both travel better in company. When the candles had left small lakes of wax and the benches had remembered every back that borrowed them, the priest and the barber slipped into the yard to set the next act upon its wheels. They returned with an ox cart and a wooden cage, a travelling lattice of slats, not cruel, but convincing. The carter wore a mask of brown paper and a curious hat. I have seen saints painted with less imagination. The priest whispered the plan to me in a voice made of good intentions and borrowed rope. We would persuade Don Quixote that enchanters, out of envy, had decreed he must be transported enchanted to where his glory would be revealed. He, being a friend to marvels, would submit for the sake of the lady and the law. Permit me a faithful nail from the old history to fix this scene to its rightful beam. They set a wooden cage upon an ox cart, and, with solemn faces, declared that the knight must be borne away in it by the will of enchanters. Don Quixote, believing the ceremony, entered with a dignity that made the slats ashamed to be slats. I stood near enough to catch the look that passed between courage and courtesy. It said, "For the good of the story, I consent." The priest intoned a few Latin syllables, not all of them baptized, but sober enough to pass, and made a sign that resembled a blessing from a distance and prudence up close. Don Quixote, moved as men are by rites that remember their childhood, bowed his head and declared that sorcery could chain his body, but never his will. He stepped into the cage without complaint, as if boarding a ship whose captain he trusted to land him where honor keeps a house. The basin of Mambrinor double-purpose moon was set like a crown on his brow. Rocinante followed the cart with a humility that made even the oxen reconsider their pride. I will not pretend I liked it. There is a difference between telling a story to cheer a friend and closing a door between him and the knight he loves. But I saw Dorothea's hands steady on the rail and the priest's mouth set in that line a father wears when he must carry a sleeping child away from a fire that has learned bad manners. If a ruse returns a man to the road that bread and reason can travel, perhaps the lie is only a borrowed lantern. We moved out under a sky that had decided to be kind. The cart creaked the old syllables of journey. The oxen's hooves spoke patience. Don Quixote spoke softly of Dulcinea, as if the slats between them were reeds in a river, and his words could bend them aside. At each turn he asked whether the Princess Micomicona was safe. Safer than her sorrow, I told him, and safer than your bruises, thanks to your cage. He smiled at that, half for the joke, half for the thought that a prison chosen for love is a kind of pilgrimage. To lighten the road, let me give you two small village mercies. First, once, when a roof threatened to teach Rain new habits, the neighbours set a frame of poles under the sag and called it a scaffold. The children named it a stage and played kings upon it. The roof held long enough for the mason to come. Second, my Teresa sometimes tells our daughter to sit inside a circle, traced with chalk until her temper has time to forget itself. It is a magic ring, she says. The girl believes, calms, and the ring keeps no one out and yet keeps peace in. Not all cages shame us. Some remind our hearts not to trample the tomatoes. At a wayside we encountered officers of the Holy Brotherhood who sniffed at our ceremony as dogs sniff at unfamiliar shoes. The priest, who understands both scripture and shoes, showed them the letter of our necessity and the handwriting of our patience. A few coins bowed where arguments might have quarrelled. The officers, satisfied that justice had been consulted, wished the enchanted gentleman a safe unenchantment and went about their rounds. I paid attention. Governors, I am told, must learn which disputes are best settled with laws and which with bread. Sancho, permit me the modest third person, walked beside the cart and counselled himself on the nature of loyalty. A friend's dignity is a goat. It will eat whatever is green and find trouble on any ledge. Your job is not to beat it from the cliff, but to lead it by a handful of herbs to safer grass. That is all the philosophy I have ever trusted. In the castle yard, for such it remained to my master, the landlord asked whether an enchanted guest pays in enchanted coin. I replied that enchantments honour only the currency of gratitude and future custom. He frowned, then softened. Men who keep doors understand that hospitality is a war fought daily in small trenches. I promised to mend a hinge and tell a good tale by the fire. We shook hands, a hinge and a tale. There are governments founded on less. Night threw its shawl over us. Through the slats I could see my master's face settle into that peace which a man wears when he believes his suffering has been catalogued by a higher clerk. Dorothea sat near, still princess, watching like a statute written by kindness. The priest murmured that we would turn toward our village with dawn. The barber fed the oxen as if they were actors needing applause. I leaned against Ruccio, who gives better sermons by breathing than many friars give by speaking, and I listened to the cage talk to the night in wooden whispers. "Sancho," Don Quixote called softly, "are you there?" "I am, sir." if these enchanters bear me away.
Remember that courage travels without luggage. And bread, I said, travels better with a knife. He laughed, the sound of a man who has not misplaced his compass. Tell Dulcinea, he added, that I submit to this because I must, not because I doubt. I promised, and the promise sat between my ribs like a careful coal, warm enough to outlast weather. Allow me one lean quotation by way of fair use and faithfulness. He said that they may take my body, but not my will, a sentence that wears armor without rattling. I have carried it in my pocket ever since, beside a dry fig and the memory of a better day. But we still wonder whether the truth we bend for a friend's rescue returns to straightness when the rescue is done. If the cage teaches him to step back into daylight with humility and health, it is a crutch, blessed by its cure. If it teaches us to treat faith like a puppet that dances when we pull, we have injured more than pride. The path between pity and paternalism is as narrow as a plank over a well. Cross it with eyes open and do not linger. Before sleep, I walked around the cage once, as I do around the vineyard after pruning, to make sure each cut will mean more grapes and not more grief. I touched the slats good wood, honest, and told them to remember they were scaffolding, not sentence. I asked Dulcinea, whose real name I often hear Aldanzato lend her second-best miracle, the one that makes stubborn men gentle without breaking their backs. Then I lay down between Rocinante's patience and Ruccio's snore and counted my wealth. One island still unopened, one friend not broken, one cage obedient to love. The inn sighed, the oxen dreamed of green, the stars did their old work without audience. We carried my master home in the wooden cage as gently as a village carries a saint on feast day, without agreeing on doctrine, but agreeing on care. At the gate, the housekeeper and niece burst into tears that washed away every sly rope and borrowed Latin we had used upon him. Dorothea laid aside her princess like a mantle folded for later truth. The priest and our barber exchanged the look of men who have made a hard decision with soft hands. Don Quixote stepped from the cage of his own accord as one disembarks from a ship whose voyage has been honorable, if unwise. "They caged my body," he said to me low, "not my will." I nodded. Sometimes a sentence is a splint. It doesn't heal the bone, but it keeps the bone honest while healing happens. Days settled on the house like patient hens. My master slept, woke, argued mildly with the shadows, and let broth do its old parish work. I went home to Teresa, who heard cage and princess, and said the sensible thing: eat first, confess later. Our little Sanchica measured my pockets for sweets and found only proverbs. Life returned to its steady gears, the field, the market, a hinge to mend, a mule to unpuzzle. And then, as happens when a fire thinks itself ash, someone blew. He was the bachelor Sanson Carrascalitha, learned, nose like a quill, eyes with ink already in them. He came bearing a strange loaf, fame. "Good Sancho," he said, "there is a history of your master printed and sold on good paper. I have read it." He named the author, Said Hamete Benengeli, an Arab chronicler if one believes the preface, and praised how truthfully our follies and mercies had been set down. He repeated phrases from the book the way a peddler rings his wares. Don Quixote listened as a man listens to a mirror placed in the street. Alarmed and delighted, not entirely trusting the angle. Do not think me made of wood. Hearing my own Sancho on other people's tongues gave me a tickle and a caution both. Fame is a goat that eats from every hand,
It will lick your palm today and butt your ribs tomorrow. Yet my master glowed as if Dulcinea herself had sent him a bottle of mourning. If our story is printed, he said, then our duty is to continue it honourably. Across the yard the wind lifted a towel. I could swear it was a banner. Sanson, sly as a cat near cream, hinted there were adventures yet unattempted and wagers yet uncollected. The hens of prudence scattered. We prepared to ride again. We left at daybreak, as if reputation required punctuality. This time, faces turned when we passed. Men nodded who had once smirked. Even the road kept a respectful quiet, as if wary of being misquoted. Rocinante carried not only a knight, but a printed expectation. Ruccio carried, as ever, the truth. First, Don Quixote said to El Toboso, "I must kneel before Dulcinea. It is a shame to serve a name without paying it the rent of reverence." My stomach made the old poor man's curtsy. My memory, however, sat up straight. I had never seen Dulcinea except as Aldonza Lorenzo, honest, with pale and pulse. My earlier message had been stitched from hope. Now the tailor was required to produce the lady. Night found us outside Toboso, where the houses keep close as neighbours at an illness. The town slept the sleep of people who must rise early. Dogs argued in the language of small territories. A moon, not quite committed, soldered chimney to sky, led me, my master whispered, to her palace. The word palace hung over the roofs like a very polite joke. I stalled first with confidence, then with coughs, then with the sudden discovery that I had mislaid the exact street where a queen keeps court in a village with 2 streets. "Your worship," I said, "let me go ahead to prepare her greatness for your arrival." He agreed, and I slipped into the lanes like a needle, seeking the right seam. Truth is a mare that sometimes refuses the bridle. I circled once, twice, thrice, and found nothing but doors that had learned patience and wells that had learned silence. So I manufactured the kindness I could not find. Returning, I said, "Sir, Dulcinea is walking abroad disguised as a peasant, as great ladies often do to taste the night. If we wait at the field's edge near the threshing floor, she will pass. Even now, telling you, my tongue feels the weight of the thread I pulled. We took our place by the open ground where the moon makes every straw confess its shadow. Soon there came 3 village girls astride donkeys, skirts tucked for riding, hair tied back in ropes, the healthy smell of garlic and labour preceding them like a herald that tells the truth by accident. "Behold," I whispered, rising to the part abandoned by sleep and adopted by necessity, Dulcinea and 2 ladies in waiting. Don Quixote strained his eyes as one who reads a sacred text by the light of a reluctant candle. He saw as any eye taught by books must 3 peasant girls. I said, as any squire taught by love must own princess. He tried to dismount to kneel and found that the girths had conspired with the hour. The saddle held him as a pot holds stew. "I cannot, Sancho," he murmured, tugging at straps that had learned stubbornness from fate. "I cannot." One of the girls, startled by a man muttering apologies to the moon, clicked at her donkey and made to pass. I moved quickly. "Your Grace Dulcinea," I said, hat in hand, "receive the homage of your vassal, who has conquered giants and tamed lions in your name." She looked at me with the broad kindness of those who work hard and cannot afford to complicate their evenings. "Out of the way," she said, though not unkindly. Her donkey flicked an ear, a gesture that translates the same in every kingdom. Don Quixote stared, and then sighed the way a man sighs when a puzzle chooses to remain a puzzle. Enchanters, he said gently, have again coarsened the world to injure my satisfaction. They have transformed my lady into what you see, so that I may not fill my eyes with her true brightness. I coward, friend, accomplice, Squire took the escape he offered. I agreed. They have cloaked her glory in village cloth. Such is envy. The three girls vanished into the road's soft grammar. We were left with hoof prints and explanations. Let me hammer one faithful nail from the old tale. In that meeting, my master would swear that Dulcinea's beauty had been enchanted into rustic shape, while I, to save his honour, swore the rustic shape was a disguise for beauty. Between us we built a bridge sturdy enough to carry us out of embarrassment and delicate enough to tremble in every breeze. It has trembled under me ever since. We sat on a low wall, the basin of Mambrino hanging from the saddle, caught the moon whole, and then sliced it in two with its rim. Don Quixote asked if I was certain. I answered with the craft of a husband who has promised to fix the roof tomorrow. As certain as bread of hunger, sir. He smiled, thin but warm. Then it suffices, he said. Her will, like mine, cannot be enchanted. We rode a little way without speaking, our silence filled with the sound of a village sleeping, and the world refusing to change its hat for either of us. Allow me 2 small breezes to loosen this knot. First, once, a neighbour boy put on his father's cap to carry wood at dusk. The path, I swear, walked straighter under him. The cap did not add a single finger to his height, but it corrected his spine. Second, a cheap mirror in our kitchen makes every face kinder. Teresa says it saves fights and flour. If that is illusion, it is one that keeps bread unburned. Back on the road, I tasted guilt like a clove left too long in the mouth, warm, medicinal, not sweet. Had I wronged him, or had I guarded his courage from the small knives of fact? He spoke first, with that gravest courtesy. Sancho, you have seen with faith. I have seen with experience. Between us, perhaps, we have seen the whole. I nodded, wishing the whole were not so costly. But we still wonder whether a merciful lie told to keep a noble heart from breaking on the wheel of ordinary truth plants a weed that will later choke the garden, or a stake that lets a tender vine grow straight. If the lie steals bread, it is villainy. If it adds bread to hope, perhaps it is stewardship. Yet habit stands at the door. Lie often enough in love's name, and you will one day forget the name of love. Toward dawn we turned our bridle toward further roads, for fame had fetched more chapters than sleep can digest. Don Quixote rode quietly, as a man does after confession. I rode noisily, as a donkey does after forgiveness. I promised myself, by Teresa's apron and my daughter's laughter, to find a way some day to bring the real and the royal into a single face, so that my master might kneel without catching his spur or his heart. For now we had the printed book behind us, the unwritten before us, and between them 2 travellers who would continue to spell the world with mismatched alphabets, his of glory, mine of bread. If we read patiently, perhaps the sentence will still make sense. It was the hour when the sun keeps its own counsel and even chatterbox birds surrender to heat. The road lifted and fell like the breathing of a sleeping ox, and from the rise ahead there came a cart drawn by mules, its canvas hood propped like a humble chapel. A man walked beside it in a green jerkin, shouting to us before we were within hat throw. "Clear the way!" he cried. "For the love you bear your skins, clear the way. I carry lions for the king." The word lions moved through the air with its old authority. Even the dust stood still to hear it. Don Quixote drew rein and sat very straight, as if the day had finally remembered his address. "Lions," he said softly, and in that softness I heard all the books he had read wake up together. "Sancho," he continued, "here is an adventure that does not consult ambiguity. No magician can disguise a lion." My stomach, that cautious counsellor, suggested that some lions, particularly the hungry, have no need of disguise to spoil a squire's afternoon. "Sir," I offered, "if a road wishes to be famous, it may do so without being shortened by our funeral." The keeper came up, cap in hand, sweating in useful sentences. Within the cart, he explained, were two great beasts in iron-barred cages. "Gifts for His Majesty. They have not eaten today, so they travel light," he added, which was a kindness of information, if not of comfort. Don Quixote's eyes shone the steady shine of a man who has found a truth big enough to carry. "Friend," he said, "set down the cages and open them. I will show the world whether I serve Dulcinea with my tongue alone." The keeper looked at me the way a man looks at a ladder when he has just counted its rungs twice and found one missing. Let me fix a faithful nail from the old history. The lion keeper warned my master that opening the cage in the open would end badly for the neighborhood, but Don Quixote insisted, and so the cart was halted, the cage turned toward the field, and the keeper, after many prayers, not in any church calendar, prepared to draw the bolt. As for me, I confess without expense to my honor that I sought a tree whose opinion of me was charitable, and climbed it with an industry that would have impressed my schoolmaster had I ever had one. If the lion should ask for me, I called down, say that I am away on governor's business. Don Quixote dismounted. He cut a figure of admirable contradiction, a man whose armor had been patched by embarrassment and polished by resolve. He set his lance aside and drew his sword, not from anger, but as a man removes his hat in church. He told the keeper to let out whichever lion wished to be first, for I am indifferent to seniority in matters of courage. The keeper, who was not indifferent to his employment, begged one last time for wisdom to dress as caution. My master replied with that grave courtesy that leaves no refuge for delay. "Open."
The bolt slid with a sound like an old verdict. The door rose the width of a lion's thought. I felt the tree consult its roots. The male inside, vast and yellow as heat, lifted his great head and regarded the world with an attention I have seldom received from Christians. Then he yawned, a cave opening to a cave, shook his mane so that the day re-feathered itself, and placed one forepaw upon the threshold. Don Quixote widened his stance and called to the beast with a courtesy I have never heard given to creditors. "Come forth, noble sir." The lion considered. He blinked with the serenity of magistrates and cats. He looked at the sun, at the sword, at an opinion only he could hear. "Then this is the peace I offer you as exact as account." She turned, lifted his hindquarters with the dignity of a bishop mounting stairs, lay down facing the back wall, and with his rump presented to us the kind of argument that defeats both rhetoric and biography. The keeper laughed first, because life had broken his fear with humor. I laughed next, because laughter is a permission that saves men from saying worse. Don Quixote did not laugh. He sheathed his sword with a deliberation that taught the gesture new manners. "Shut him," he said gently. "He has performed the part of a wise enemy to know when to retreat." The keeper thrust the door down, happier than a man who has just married off an expensive daughter. He promised to swear anywhere, before anyone,
that he had seen a knight stand ready before an open lion, and that the lion, being no fool, had declined the conference. Don Quixote climbed again into the saddle and addressed me in the tone he uses to convince the future to write down what it has just seen. "Sancho, from this hour I am the Knight of the Lions." I scrambled from my tree, dusting my dignity as one does a coat, too honest to be offended by use. "Your worship," I said, "I rejoice that the lion has the good taste of a courtier and the manners of a nun at vespers. Were he less pious, my governorship would have begun with a memorial." The cart was set again upon its way. The keeper, still grateful to his employment, accepted from my master a small purse for the delay in the testimony. If justice were always so tidy, even Teresa would forgive it the time it takes. We rode on in a silence bright as metal. Don Quixote bore himself as men do after confessions that end in absolution. Lighter, not foolish; taller, not proud; Rocinante, philosopher of measured steps, seemed to approve. "Remember, Sancho," my master said at last, "that fortune often chooses absurd instruments to crown a man. A basin for a helm, a cage for a carriage, a rump for a herald. Valour is to stand ready unembarrassed by Providence's choice of trumpet." I considered this and found to my surprise that it entered my understanding like a spoon that fits the bowl without scraping. For air and to set the meal with a little salt permit me 2 village breezes. First, our neighbour Basilio once challenged a dull-witted bull by stepping into the field with a frying pan. The bull ignored him and continued eating. Basilio returned home, called the animal a philosopher, and sold the pan for a good price as proven bravado. Second, a child in our street practices to be a soldier by marching at the hen yard. The hens, being mothers, simply move aside. The boy returns proud because he did not flinch. The hens return proud because they did not squabble. If anyone asks who won, the answer is supper. Let me pin here another faithful detail the chronicler sets down. After that day my master changed his title from Sorrowful Face to Knight of the Lions. I approved the revision. A man may own his sorrow without advertising it. A lion, even one who chooses peace, is better company on a banner than a bruise. Yet I will not pretend the lesson is simple. Did my master risk his life? Yes, though the risk was lessened by a beast's superior sense. Did he boast? Not more than men do when they have been spared and wish to honour the sparing. As for me, I wrote a proverb against the bark of my heart. Some victories are a door that stayed shut because you knocked politely. It is not the kind of saying that warms a tavern, but it keeps cold from getting arrogant. At noon we stopped near a ruined wayside shrine where time and stone keep each other company. Don Quixote ate with appetite, the portion that belongs to survival, not greed. He spoke little of the lions and much of Dulcinea, for a man's centre is not always the subject of his latest story. I, who had spent part of the morning in a tree, found my courage returning like a cat that forgives the bucket you threw near it. I told him that Teresa once said a woman admires not just a man who wins, but a man who knows when not to fight the kitchen. Then he smiled. Dulcinea will approve today's diplomacy. As we saddled to go, the road yielded a few spectators who had heard of a knight defying lions. They approached with the careful generosity that farmers grant to meteor showers. Don Quixote received their salutes as alms given to honor's beggar. He did not enlarge the tale, he shortened it, which is rarer. I marked that down as a sign of health and resolved to double his supper accordingly. A little meat rewards a little modesty. This is the arithmetic by which a poor household keeps its saints fed. But we still wonder whether a courage that finds no resistance counts as courage, or whether valor requires the wound to stamp its receipt. If bravery stands ready and the world refuses to test it, has anything been proved? Tell me then, when a storm lifts and your roof remains whole, do you feel cheated of heroism or grateful for weather? I will keep my tree, my master his title, and the lion his privacy, and call that settlement generous to all parties. The road resumed its impartial advice. Ahead lay houses too rich for our taxes and richer still in inventions, a duke and duchess, whose game would wind us upon a spool of courtesies sharpened into needles. Behind lay a rump dignified into heraldry. Between the two I found my balance again. One hand on the reins, one on the wineskin, one eye upon the pot, and one upon the page the chronicler writes. If I am to be a governor some day, I must learn the law that kept a lion peaceable. Not all doors are opened by force. Some you honor by guarding shut, and in that restraint there is no less bravery than in the shout. We rode until the day cooled into sense. Rocinante counted stones. Ruccio counted mercies, I counted titles, and found that the one newly minted rang as well as any coin. Knight of the Lions. May such money spend in the markets that matter, kindness, patience, and the occasional tree placed where a squire's heart can climb before his feet do. Power sometimes dresses kindness in velvet and mischief in lace. We learned this when a duke and duchess, great lords, who had read our freshly printed history as if it were a map to an afternoon's amusement, sent pages to invite us into their estate. Trumpets greeted our dust as though the road itself were nobility arriving late. Don Quixote bowed with that long music in his spine. I bowed with the shorter tune learned in kitchens. They called him Knight of the Lions and called me Sancho, which is all the title I have ever needed, except when someone is ladling stew too slowly. They lodged us handsomely, laid linen on our fatigue, and fed us courses that introduced themselves by smell before arriving by plate. Laughter rained down from balconies, compliments rose up from the floor. Servants practiced the art of appearing when wished for and disappearing when honesty required. I am not blind. Hospitality can be a window or a mirror. Here it was a little of both. We saw ourselves flattered, and we saw our hosts entertained by the mirror's tricks. After dinner the Duchess, a woman whose gaze carried both mercy and mischief, inquired of Dulcinea with interest, sharpened into embroidery. My master spoke of his lady as a priest speaks of a sacrament withheld for reverence. Truth pricked me behind the ribs, but I kept my thread in the needle. The story must be hemmed before it can wear a man without scandal. The Duke nodded, as men do when their pockets already hold the next move in a game. The move arrived the following day, wrapped in ceremony. A lady appeared in mourning, the Dueña Dolorida, also called the Countess Trifaldiface, veiled, beard visible, tears arranged with theatrical accuracy. Behind her stood 12 dueñas as solemn as brooms. She told a tale of a kingdom cursed by a giant named Malambruno and begged Don Quixote to free her mistress from bearded shame. The cure, she declared, would require a journey on the wooden horse Clavileño, who could fly across the world faster than gossip. Permit me a faithful nail from the old chronicle. The dukes had a great wooden horse brought forth, named Clavileño, with a peg for a neck and a tail primed with fireworks. They blindfolded us, sat us astride, and feigned wind with bellows while pinching and pricking to imitate angels and devils at altitude. "Do not be afraid," said the Duchess sweetly, which is the standard prayer of those who intend mischief with Polish. Don Quixote mounted with the gravity a priest gives a reliquary. I climbed behind, my hands where they could argue with falling, blindfolded. I felt the bellows huff me into courage and smelled the candle grease of manufactured heaven. "Sancho," my master said, "we are rising." "Aye," I answered, "and my stomach is rising too to greet the upper provinces, I confess. When you cannot see, even decency grows a tail and tickles." We flew. Voices below muffled to sound like far countries, announced oceans, wraths, and castles passing under our wooden belly. I loosened the string of fear with 2 proverbs, one about pigs who dream of acorns, and one about men who dream of islands while sitting on a cartwheel. Then the tale of Clavileño exploded, a roar, a light, a heat that slapped sense and nonsense together, and down we tumbled upon cushions arranged by people who intended mercy to be more entertaining than cruelty. The blindfolds came off. Applause replaced thunder. "You have broken the enchantment," cried the Trifaldi, whiskers trembling in victory. I bowed to the success of the fireworks and to the sturdiness of the floor. That night another chapter was staged. From a tapestry of shadows, a figure calling himself Merlin emerged, declaring that Dulcinea's disenchantment required Sancho Panza to give himself 3,300 lashes with his own hand and on his own flesh, to be counted only when delivered with intentional sting. "Here is my exact memory's ration of fair use," he said. "I must do it voluntarily, not by force, with his own hand and with pain." Don Quixote looked at me as a thirsty man looks at a well that would rather be a mirror. "I am not made of martyrdom. I told Merlin that my flesh, being the only house my mother gave me, charged rent. If lashes were needed, I would sell them dearer than walnuts, and I would deliver them gradually. As a man plants trees, some in spring, some in fall, so the orchard does not die of zeal." The Duke laughed behind his beard. The Duchess hid her smile in a fan. My master pleaded with a courtesy that could have persuaded hail to fall softly. We struck a bargain of installments and price. Later, in the dark, I asked Ruccio whether a donkey ever whipped himself to improve a lady's fortune. Ruccio, being wise, answered by chewing. Between these plays, Altisidora made, with eyes quick as larks and tongue that never paid rent, Latta sang ballads hinting she loved my master. She swooned once, purely for rehearsal, and was revived by methods that pinched me more than they kissed her. The house delighted in its reflections of chivalry, of vanity, of servants pretending to be queens, and queens pretending to be servants of jokes. I kept count of the bread, because bread is the only actor that cannot fake its own arrival. Let me loosen the belt of memory with 2 village truths. First, a wooden spoon, held with enough ceremony, can taste like silver but only until soup cools. Second, when boys play war with reeds, their mothers play peace with towels. In our town, the towels win. The Duke's games were reeds. I listened for towels and tried to be one when possible. Soft, serviceable, drying the embarrassment without scolding the head that dripped. Still, I confess a pinch of needle in the cloth. Power enjoys jokes that leave no bruise on its own fingers. When they set us on Clavileño, I smelled their delight. Yet I also smelled something better, the Duchess's quiet respect, when Don Quixote spoke to her of honor as if it were bread to be divided cleanly. She, who could afford 100 illusions, leaned forward to listen to one man's faith as if it were rare and perishable. In that leaning there was more nobility than in the fireworks. We stayed some days, learning the corridors by their perfumes and the courtyards by their tendency to hold laughter. I tried new dishes and old proverbs. Don Quixote lectured on the governance of islands, and the Duke, who had a theatre's pockets, decided to make my prophesied office a spectacle. A messenger arrived, costumed better than the truth usually is, announcing that by right of services to Micomicon and merits printed in the book, Sancho Panza was appointed governor of Barataria. The name sounded like a loaf made of air, but I will not deny the fragrance. That night I considered Teresa, her hands, her apron, the basket that knows how our hunger counts aloud. Could I govern? I have weighed wheat, judged quarrels about hens, and remembered debts for men who could not afford paper. Perhaps government is only that with louder bells. The Duchess pressed my hand and told me to be just and cheerful. The Duke reminded me to be firm and brief. Don Quixote embraced me with tears and counselled mercy tied to law as a mule is tied to a trough, near enough to drink, not near enough to break the rope. Let me fix one more faithful nail for those who collect them. Before I went to Barataria, Don Quixote admonished me to restrain my proverbs, to sleep little, eat less, and listen much. He quoted authorities I could not spell, but I understood the recipe: more ears than mouth, more water than wine, more justice than jokes. I promised, with the caution of a man who knows the jokes are braided into the justice like fat into meat. But we still wonder whether the games of the great even, when wrapped in lace and meant to offend no baker's child, teach a poor man clarity or only cleverness. If they sharpen his eyes to the tricks that hurt real bread. Perhaps the play is school. If they merely train him to laugh at his own hunger, the play is tax. I chose, while the house glittered and the horse smoked, and Merlin sold lashes by the dozen, to treat every jest as a lesson, every lesson as provision. Tomorrow the curtain would lift on Barataria. I resolved to carry into that stage the only instruments a peasant truly trusts: a straight scale, a clean ladle, and a heart that can be taught. They led me to Barataria at dusk, with torches that made even puddles look ceremonial. I was told it was an island, though my eyes, being natives of geography, saw only a walled town cupped by fields. The Duke called it a jewel set in water you cannot see, which is how rich men describe taxes. Still, a gate is a crown if a crowd is willing, and the people, drilled in courtesy by their betters, cried, "Long live Governor Sancho!" I bowed as well as a man can bow, who keeps a hand on his purse out of habit, and on his heart out of fear of disappointing it. They seated me in a chair of state, so large I felt like a boy on his father's saddle. Don Quixote's counsels rang in my head like a bell. Listen much, speak little, sleep less, eat modestly, punish with tears in your eyes, favor the poor without robbing the rich. And I tucked my proverbs back like knives at a wedding and resolved to cut only bread with them. The first business of government arrived on its own 2 feet, a farmer and an innkeeper who accused one another of cheating over a measure of wine. The innkeeper swore by saints, the farmer swore by weather. I took the jar they argued over, wiped the lip with my sleeve — it is useful for authority to have sleeves — and smelled. "There is a coin in the wine," I said, for my nose met the sadness of copper. He who hid it put his thumb on the scale. The innkeeper blushed the colour of the coin's memory. I fined the habit and forgave the man. That was the first lesson. Punish the trick, not the trade. A stranger case followed. 2 old men disputed over a staphone, claimed to have loaned 10 gold crowns. The other claimed to have repaid them by returning this very stick, and therefore owed nothing more. Their words chased each other until the room needed air. I asked to hold the staff. It weighed like a quiet problem. "Break it," I ordered. Inside fell the 10 crowns, tidy as rain into a basin. The room laughed its approval, and I laughed last, because a governor should not be the first to enjoy his own joke. Faithful nail for those who keep ledgers, the coins hidden in a cane is told in the old chronicle with my name attached, though I stole the trick from the branch itself, which taught me to suspect what is too light for its size. "Governor," whispered my clerk, "the people love a quick judgment." "Then, clerk," I said, "we shall sometimes go slow, lest love eat what it praises." Letters arrived like weather. A page in the Duke's livery brought one from Teresa. She asked if governors still had husbands, if titles stopped the ache in the back, and whether the apron might be retired in favour of a shawl. She sent blessings to Ruccio and advice about clean shirts. I kissed the paper. It smelled faintly of our kitchen's smoke. I answered that the shawl must wait, the clean shirt would come, and that a governor's first treasure is to know his own house still holds him. I also wrote to Don Quixote, telling him that power, like a stubborn mule, moves best when you speak kindly and carry a stick you seldom use. At dinner I learned a new grammar. A certain Dr. Pedro Reccio de Tirteafuerae, physician imported with trumpets by those who stage-managed my glory, presented himself as guardian of my health. Each time a dish approached, he whisked it away with a wand, as if fear itself had hired him. "This roast breeds vapours," he said. "This salad provokes melancholy. This rabbit hops directly into apoplexy." The man had a library in his mouth and famine in his hands. "Sir Doctor," I pleaded, "governors eat to govern. Only the dead live by regimen alone." He insisted that thin soup and a sip of water were emperor's fare. I imagined Teresa seeing me at the head of a table that could not keep a promise, and nearly resigned that very night to the kingdom of spoons. I did not resign. I sent the doctor away with a fee in compliments, and ordered, quietly, a bowl of garlic broth from the guardhouse. Between two honest pieces of bread, I learned the second lesson. Keep a private spoon. Cases multiplied like beans in a good year. A young man swore that a bridge carried an ancient law. Those who crossed must tell truth about their destination, under penalty of hanging. Liars would die. Truth-tellers pass. "I go to be hanged," said a traveller. And the wardens were split. If he told truth, he must pass. But if he passed, he lied. "How judge this knot?" they asked. I thought of Ruccio, who refuses to be moved by puzzles, and ruled simply, "Let him go free and repair the bridge law, which is cleverer than it is just." I know the chroniclers bend this tale different ways. In mine, the rope learned humility. Each evening I walked the market, counting prices while the sun counted backs. I fined a baker for cutting loaves too thin, and raised the pay of the watchman who had a good nose for smoke. I told the butchers to water their honesty, not their meat. I listened more than I liked, and spoke less than I wished, and discovered that justice travels more quickly on short words. I also learned the style of traps. A man offered me a purse, heavy with gratitude. I told him I preferred light gratitude, the kind that walks beside you when you meet a complaint. He left, lighter by a purse, and heavier by a lesson. Another came with a complaint newly laundered. I wrung it over the basin, and returned it to him still wet, but cleaner. He bowed and called me Solomon. I told him Solomon had more wives and fewer proverbs. For air, let me loosen our belt with two homely moments. First, a cat wandered into the hall during a petition and meowed as if it too had a grievance. I ordered fish for it and tiredness for myself, and both petitions were satisfied. Second, a child approached to ask whether a governor could make rain. I told him no, but that a governor could make a shade. I had awnings strung over the wells for mothers at noon. That purchased 3 bolts of cloth and a promise brought me more thanks than the best speech. The jokes of the great, however polished, carry tax. At midnight, a trumpet fractured the dark. The watch shouted of an enemy attack. I armed, rallied the town, and took my stand at the gate with halberdiers whose beards knew the grammar of fear. Donkeys brayed like horns, pots banged like drums. We threw back a ragtag swarm of intruders who wore pillow helmets and sword belts cut from old reins. I killed no man. I broke 3 sticks and 2 arguments. In daylight I found masks in the dust and laughter on the battlements. The enemy had been the Duke's masquerade, staged to test my temper. My ribs remembered sticks pitched from high windows by servants eager for applause. My soul remembered that some jokes peel their fig leaves from courage. I called the town together. Neighbours, I said, I thank you, bow, and I thank the night, which taught me that valour can be made to dance. Still, I prefer it to walk. I set fines for throwing stones where bread should be thrown, and decreed that no play shall bruise a poor man's sleep. It is an odd thing. People will tolerate injustice longer than noise. Around then the doctor returned with his wand, intent on saving me from dinner and life. I dismissed him entirely and ate to prove I existed. He left offended, which is how certain medicines depart when the disease declines them. I slept better that night than any since my birth. In the morning, a messenger brought another letter from Teresa News of Sanchica, a recipe for chickpeas, and a line that undid me. Remember, you are Sancho while you govern, so that you can still be Sancho when you return. Soon after, a squad of officers arrived, more masks, more mischief, declaring that enemies had seized the fields. We marched, we were ambushed, and I received more thumps than a carpet on washing day. I swung my staff where I could, protected a child with my body, and tasted dust of a flavour the Duke's kitchen could not invent. When the play ended and applause tried to buy my forgiveness, I smiled the smile a man saves for a loan he will not renew. I returned to my chair of state and found it larger and colder. That evening I resigned. I told the steward, who had been both kind and cruel in the measure required by his employment, that I had learned what I came for, that governing is like stewing. It asks for time, salt, and patience, and that I had none left to sell at their price. I asked for Ruccio, my cloak, my staff, and the way out. They offered me more trappings. I chose the road. A crowd gathered. Some wept because theatre can move hearts honestly, even when it was born to play. I bowed to them as to a field after harvest. Eat well, I said. Be fair when you can. When you cannot, be brief. But we still wonder whether a poor man should taste power, if power was set like a trap, baited with drums and beards. If the taste teaches him to smell the trap in other kitchens and to love plain bread more fiercely, then the lesson is bread itself. If the taste turns his tongue against his own life, the lesson is a poison that calls itself perfume. I chose the first reading and walked. On the road I felt lighter and wiser, in the same degree you feel after a winter cold, no longer coughing, but still respectful of wind. I thought of Don Quixote and how he would praise my resignation as the noblest victory, the government of one's self. I thought of Teresa, whose shawl would come, if it came, from our own saving and not from a duke's applause. I thought of the awings over the wells and the cat with its fish. The world is governed in such handfuls. If you neglect them, the larger decrees go hungry. When night bent over the fields, I counted my riches, a staff that had found coins where lies hid them, a name that had not grown too far from its boots, a donkey who recognized my breath, and a heart that, having sat in a high chair, found the ground no stranger. The road ahead bent toward my master, who by then was walking under a sky full of invented stars and lions that preferred peace. I would bring him my report that Barataria had proved to be a mirror, and in it I had seen Sancho, not smaller than before, only truer. I found my master on the road that leans toward Catalonia, walking as men walk after storms lighter for having kept their roofs. I reported what Barataria had taught me, that law is a stew requiring patience and salt, and that a governor who refuses bread soon governs nobody, not even himself. Don Quixote heard me with a tenderness that made my failure feel like a rung in a good ladder. "You have governed the best province," he said. "Yourself." We shook the dust from our names and followed the mileposts that whisper Barcelona when the wind is in a generous mood. A few days along we met a showman with a trained ape perched on his shoulder and a theatre folded into a box. He called himself Maese Pedro, though I later remembered a galley slave who bore another name and some old debts to truth. The ape, he boasted, could tell the past and present, never the future. Apes, like priests with good boundaries, decline that post for a fee light enough to tempt the poor. The beast blinked at me and, with chatter worthy of a clerk, revealed that I had been a governor 3 days and had resigned because doctors starve more efficiently than famine. I laughed. It is pleasant now and then to be known by a creature who mispronounces your sorrows. Maese Pedro invited us to a puppet show, The Rescue of Melisendra by Don Gaiferos, that old romance which wraps drums around love to help it march. The little stage appeared. The Moorish city was built of pasteboard. The knights had strings for tendons, and a wooden trumpet rehearsed our emotions. Children pressed their noses to the edge of wonder. I pressed mine, just enough to smell wood smoke and paint honest perfumes in the theatre of the poor. My master sat forward, eyes bright as coins, his breath-taking sides with the persecuted. Here is a faithful nail from the old account, borrowed sparingly in the spirit of fair use. When the Moors pursued the fleeing lovers, Don Quixote, forgetting the strings, cried that he would not stand by while Christian princesses were carried off, and leapt upon the stage, laying about with his sword and scattering puppets like grain on a threshing floor. Children shrieked with the joy of spectacle. Maese Pedro shrieked with the sorrow of property. I have seldom seen the difference between the two more clearly. When the dust of sawdust settled, Melisendra, being wood, had lost no virtue. Gaiferos, being wood, had kept all his promise. The Moorish guard lay in splinters. And Maese Pedro mourned a kingdom worth, by his estimate, more than a modest man should have to count with his hat off. Don Quixote, perceiving the harm and the honour in the same instant, drew his purse and paid what damages he could, then more, by way of apology to the art he had accidentally defeated. It is an odd thing. He never pays so handsomely as when he has confused bravery with tidying up the world too fast. On we went, with a purse lighter and a conscience carefully balanced. The road tilted toward hills that smell of rosemary and men who have learned to earn a living outside the law. We were stopped by a band with courtesy in their hands and muskets in their belts, led by the famous Roque Guinarta thief, whom even justice hesitates to dislike. He took our measure the way a tailor does when he intends to clothe you in mercy if possible. "I steal," he said with the calm of a bookkeeper, "but I divide fairly and spill little blood." I have heard worse mission statements from richer men. Roque set his men to unwinding some captive's misery and to rewinding other men's conceit. He restored to me a pouch a lesser thief had briefly borrowed, and he listened to Don Quixote speak of honour as if it were a rope for hauling the whole countryside uphill. Honor is a poor man's horse. It will carry you where bread will not. Rock nodded, leaned on his musket like a conscience leaning on a wall, and said he would escort us to Barcelona because the city and he had business in the same books. Thus did a bandit become for a time a better guard than many hired in velvet. Allow me a small loosening of our belt with 2 village truths. First, there is a hen in our street who steals grain from every bowl and then clucks to gather the chick's thief and mother in one feather. The neighbors forgive her because the chicks are fat and the bowl is soon refilled. Second, my neighbor Perico cheats at cards by shuffling badly. His wife, who shuffles life well, forgives him and hides the deck. Some sins look better when confessed by another person's competence. We entered Barcelona on the eve of St. John, when the city dresses in lanterns and fireworks as if the sky had lent out its jewels. Don Quixote saw the sea for the first time. He who had crossed deserts of imagination stood silent before water that performs imagination's sighs without its lies. He bowed as if to an emperor, and I, who have great affection for rivers that take your laundry and return it cleaner, admired a water so faithful it breaks itself and keeps arriving. People cheered the Night of the Lions. Trumpets honored him with that particular music cities reserve for saints and spectacles. A gentleman of wit, Don Antonio Moreno, lodged us, amused by our truth and unwilling to reduce it to jest. In his house he showed us a talking head that answered questions from within a cabinet. The trick was pipes and clever placement, yet he managed it with so much kindness that the deception felt like a parable instead of a tax. Don Quixote asked profound questions. The head, being guided by men who had read our book, answered with a civility that did not shame faith. I have known harsher oracles in poorer kitchens. We visited a printing house where the air smelled of ink and linen rags, and voices argued the spelling of the world. Compositors plucked letters from their cases like harvesters. A man in an apron fed paper to an iron press that kissed it with news, and a proofreader scratched and sighed like a man mending nets with too little light. I saw, stacked on a board, a book with a title that knew my name. Don Quixote de la Mancha, and beside it, another second part by a different author than ours, a man whose malice had outrun his manners. Here is a nail from the true beam. In Barcelona, my master saw a printed book that usurped his story. He denounced the author as an impostor, and swore to make his life such that no one would counsel him to seek adventures any longer in other men's ink. He did not rage like a wounded bull. He grieved like a betrayed godfather. I felt, standing among galleys, that fame is bread baked by hands you cannot see. It feeds you and sometimes tastes of their unhappiness. The printers, being practical saints, cared for correcting as much as for praise. They argued over a comma as if a poor man's blanket depended on it. Perhaps it does. A misplaced stop can send a reader to the wrong village. Don Quixote told a young poet to prefer honor to haste. The poet replied he preferred money to hunger. Both told the truth. The press weighed them without bias and printed the day as it found it. We walked to the shore at evening. Boys chased the foam. A dog studied the tide with the gravity of a philosopher confronting a polite miracle. Don Quixote removed his helmetur ever-loyal basin and let the salt air polish his face. Sancho, he said, see how 1,000 hands build this horizon without a quarrel. Sir, I answered, and see how 1,000 mouths unbuild a loaf in perfect agreement. The sea and the table both teach abundance if you do not argue too long about ownership. That night in Don Antonio's house, Over sardines whose silver had not yet forgotten the water, we retold our puppet adventure. I confessed my embarrassment at my master's zeal, and he confessed his at my delight in garlic broth. We laughed and were cured of nothing essential, which is sometimes the best medicine. Before sleep, I wrote to Teresa that the sea is larger than any promise a duke can make, and that books, even when they lie, prove that people still wish to eat from the same plate of wonder. But we still wonder whether to smash a puppet's lie is braver than to pay for the puppets and teach the audience to see better, and whether to print a man is to preserve him or to pin him to a page where his living breath cannot turn. If ink saves courage from vanishing, let it flow. If ink steals the humbler virtues, patience, apology, the habit of listening, let the page stay blank until the heart has caught up. 2 small breezes to close the day. First, in our village, a man once saw a boy kicking a rag ball and scolded him for ruining the shape. The boy said, "Sir, the game restores it." Second, a tinker mends pots by making little holes and then filling them. A story sometimes does the same to a life. We were in Barcelona, full of holes and hope, and the city, with its lanterns and loud press and honest fish, filled us without finishing us. When I lay down, the talking head was silent, the press rested its teeth, and the sea kept its old syllabus of patience. I counted my day's wealth, 1 ape who told the truth about my belly, 1 bandit who divided like a judge, 1 city that smelled of ink and salt, 1 master who could weep for puppets and pay for them, and who, seeing his honor printed falsely, chose not wrath alone, but the harder penance of living truer than the counterfeit. Between such coins a poor man can afford to dream. Barcelona woke with the industry of swallows and the discretion of sailors. The eve of Saint John had burned its lanterns. Now the sea ironed the shore with even strokes, and the sun sat polishing coins on the horizon. We walked with Don Antonio toward the beach, where the city likes to watch its own courage rehearse on water. Don Quixote wore his basin helmet bright, his patched armor newly persuaded into dignity, and the title Knight of the Lions rode quiet on his shoulders like a well-trained hawk. I carried our wineskin and a quantity of hope trimmed to travel. There, upon the sand, stood a rider all glitter and whiteness, armor polished to an argument, a great moon painted on the shield so clear that the day itself blinked. He called himself the Knight of the White Moon, and with ceremony that would not embarrass a courtroom, challenged my master. The terms as exact as a knot. Don Quixote must confess that the challenger's lady surpassed all beauties alive, or fight with lances, and if vanquished, he must retire to his village for a year, lay down arms, and concern himself with matters not requiring wind for enemies. You and I know a certain bachelor Sanson Carrasco had opinions about my master's health and a cupboard full of disguises, but knowledge kept its hat down. Don Antonio murmured caution, the sea murmured more. Don Quixote heard only honor speaking with that quiet insistence it uses when it wants to be obeyed without being blamed. "I will not confess what my soul does not believe," he said. "Let the field decide. Permit me to drive a faithful nail from the old history straight into the beam." On the sands of Barcelona, the Knight of the White Moon, a champion later unmasked as Sanson Carrasco, overthrew Don Quixote with the first encounter, planted a lance tip upon his visor, and pronounced the vow, a year's retirement from arms under penalty of yielding his life. My master accepted, not bitter, not broken, but obedient to the very law he had lived by, which requires a knight to keep his word not only to ladies, but to defeat when it arrives dressed as truth. Now, for what my eyes kept, the two set their horses, the The crowd drew a circle in its breath. The sea paused just enough to be a witness. Rocinante started bravely, as brave, at least, as a philosopher can be against a mathematician. The lances met with a crack like a cupboard scolding a careless hand. Don Quixote fell cleanly, shoulder first, as one who has practiced falling and expects to rise a better man for it. The moon's knight leaned the length of his spear upon my master's visor and spoke the terms with courtesy, sharpened into instrument. I ran, as a squire should, and prepared my heart for whichever rope the moment offered, consolation or farewell. "Yield, sir," said the white moon, "and confess your lady less fair, or die." "Kill me," Don Quixote answered, "for Dulcinea del Toboso is the sun by which this poor earth warms." "Not so," the moon replied, "you shall live by my mercy on condition of a year's withdrawal from knight-errantry." And there, to the music of waves that keep no calendar, my master swore. He swore not as a man criticized swears, but as a farmer signs a paper that will save his house, soberly, eyes on the meaning rather than the witness. The crowd breathed again, and broke into their human grammar, some pity, some laughter, some relief, that a play had ended with no funerals. Don Antonio squeezed my shoulder. I helped Don Quixote up. The basin had earned a new dent. Pride had earned a new softness. He gazed at the moon on the victor's shield, then at the real moon fainting in daylight, and bowed unnoble curve that finished the sentence his body had begun. The white moon saluted, turned, and was the bachelor again to his own conscience, which is the hardest court. We led Rocinante to the waterline. He drank modestly, as if learning something about limits from the day. Don Quixote sat upon a rock that has probably since forgotten us, though I remember it by shape and lesson. "Sancho," he said, "fortune has reminded me that a man must harvest humility with the same attention he gives to glory. For a year I shall leave adventures to younger knees and better weather." He said it as a promise, not a punishment. That is the difference between obedience and resentment. One grows a man. The other grows a complaint. Allow me 2 breezes from the village to loosen this knot. First, in our town a miller once set his hat against a gale to prove a point. The hat flew and the mill stood, and the miller learned that flour is not impressed by arguments. Second, a boy challenged the church bell to ring louder than his shout. The bell rang. The boy laughed and brought the bell butter from his mother, which is how defeat becomes a friend. We walked back through Barcelona, where balconies had leaned out to watch the spectacle. Boys pretended to joust with oars. Girls judged the pageant with the absolute measure children bring to games that touch their dignity. A woman handed my master a sprig of rosemary for bruises, she said. He pressed it to his mouth and thanked her as if she had cured kingdoms. Defeat, I saw, had repaired his manners from excellent to exemplary. That evening Don Antonio entertained us gently, like a host who understands that laughter must not sit in the seat where grief is still finishing its soup. Over anchovies that remembered the sea in the right degree, we spoke of return. La Mancha, my master said, and the words dropped into the room as simple as bread. I will go home for a year, as sworn, and serve Dulcinea by becoming a man worthy of ordinary days. He smiled, thinly but warmly, and added, "And you, Sancho, shall govern your garden, the surest province. A faithful nail more for those who collect them with care." After the defeat on the beach, Don Quixote abandoned the title Knight of the Lions for the humbler office of a pilgrim returning. He prepared to leave Catalonia, resolved to live a year at home without arms, as the night of the white moon commanded. The chronicler records it, and my memory signs the document without squinting. We delayed 2 days to let bruises vote on our pace. On the second, the talking head confessed to us, by way of its owner's kind laughter, that it was plumline and whisper, not Pythia. Don Quixote thanked it for having deceived us with courtesy, which is the only form of lying that sometimes improves a man. We visited the press once more. The compositors lifted their eyes in a salute made of ink. The proofreader nodded like a priest with a headache and pointed at a comma he had spared us. My master told a young student that a man should earn wisdom at the price of honesty, not of his neighbour's bread. If that is not literature, it is something better, advice that can be cooked. Before we left, we walked the shore at dawn. The city's noise slept under a sheet of mist. The sea spoke its unarguable syllables. "I have been corrected," Don Quixote said. "It is a blessing that keeps." "And should we be grateful to the corrector?" I asked, thinking of the bachelor and his consolations. "We should be grateful," he answered, "to anyone who teaches us where excess ends and duty begins, provided he teaches without malice. If malice taught me, let mercy finish the lesson." But we still wonder whether a victory of restraint is less noble than a victory of arms, and whether a promise kept in defeat feeds a soul as well as a triumph devoured by pride. A house stands as proudly for having survived a storm as for having never met one. The difference is in the windows. After a storm, they learn to be opened with kinder hands. We packed. I tightened the girths with particular reverence, remembering the night in Toboso when they refused to be servants to a kneeling man. The basin rode where it always had, faithful to the double office of helmet and bowl. Rocinante accepted the road with that patience which has never once asked for a poem. Ruccio accepted the bundles and forgave me all my philosophy. Don Antonio pressed gifts upon us. We took the ones that would not make our homes suspicious: bread for the noon, coins for the road, and a blessing for the year. As Barcelona fell behind and the hills arranged themselves into a sentence we knew how to read, my master spoke quietly of Dulcinea not as a star to be chased, but as a harvest to be earned by work in plain furrows. I told him of Teresa's newest letter, how she advises that the spirit travels better when the boots are not full of holes. He laughed, promised to buy leather before metaphors, and asked me, very softly, if I would be patient with a year of smaller stories. "Sir," I said, "small stories are the ladders by which we reach the large ones without breaking our necks." Toward evening we camped under an alpargata sky, the kind that looks woven by good hands. Don Quixote wrote nothing, and yet looked written upon. Less night, more man, and therefore perhaps more night than before. I set the wineskin between us, and we counted our wealth. One vow kept, one road reclaimed, one friendship repaired by the simple art of walking together at the speed of forgiveness. In the quiet, I imagined the year ahead. La Mancha's dust telling us again the names of chores, the village measuring us not by noise but by neighbours, the bed that is not a battlefield but a school for rest. If my master grew gentler, I would not complain. If I grew wiser, Teresa would notice and add a spoon to supper. The moon rose a thinner coin than the one painted on the stranger's shield, but legal tender all the same. We slept, not as actors who fear the curtain, but as men who have agreed to intermission so the play may return truer. We turned our faces toward La Mancha, and the road recognized our steps the way an old dog recognizes its master's cough without needing to be told. The hills flattened into the plain that teaches patience. Dust rehearsed our names with the diligence of a schoolmaster who has seen truants return. We spoke less. Don Quixote rode as a man paying a vow, one measured mile at a time. I kept Ruccio steady at his side, my hand ready for a strap or a proverb, whichever the day asked for. At the village edge, the housekeeper and niece met us with tears that washed our armour cleaner than oil could. The priest and our barber arrived soon after, their concern wearing the faces of friendship and relief. My master let himself be led to his bed, not like a vanquished general, but like a farmer who knows the field has earned its rest. Fever visited, polite at first, then insistent. Broth followed, that oldest deacon of the sick room. I sat at the bed's foot and learned the grammar of breathing, how a good man's chest writes a sentence slower, kinder, nearer to a period. One morning, here is a faithful nail set within fair use and gratitude. He woke clear and said, "Friend, I am no longer Don Quixote. Call me Alonso Quixano, the Good." He asked for pardon of the books that had led him into weather his body could not afford, and he asked God to forgive a zeal that sometimes put names ahead of neighbours. The priest bowed his head as if a bell had timed the prayer perfectly. I, Sancho Panza, had eaten from both pots. Dream and dinner felt something taller than grief stand up in me. He sent for the notary. He made his will. He remembered the poor with more than sentences. He left a sum for my service. He warned his niece not to wed a man who loved books of chivalry, lest the house graduate again into homelessness. He paid debts, which is a sacrament, even when the church is a kitchen table. When the papers were done, he took my hand. "Sancho," he said, "forgive the miles I made you carry my weather." I hurried to confess my own lies, the gentler ones told to keep his hope from tripping on small stones. He smiled. Mercy keeps accounts that justice cannot read. I begged him, like a child who wants recess to last, to try one last adventure, a shepherd's life among the streams, with flutes and sheep that would accept our governance better than dukes had. We would be Quixotin and Panchino. The hills would be our court. Our lawsuits would be about shade and clean water. He pressed my fingers. "Good Sancho, the year has been commanded. The flock must be tended where I am here." He spoke without scolding. Even my foolishness felt blessed for having tried to dress grief in sandals. Neighbours came to sit in the doorway and lend their silence. The bachelor Sanson kept his hat in his lap and his remorse in his throat. The barber polished the same razor for an hour, finding no face worth cutting. The priest read a psalm whose meaning I don't remember because his voice did the work better than the words. Outside, a cart squeaked. Inside, the bed learned to keep still. To loosen the bindings a moment, take 2 small stitches from village cloth. First, Teresa keeps a cracked pitcher we call the good one because it tells the truth about water. When guests come, she uses it anyway and adds a sprig of mint. Second, a hen in our yard lays fewer eggs than her boast suggests. But she never misses the dawn. Not everything must be much to be faithful. Not everything faithful must be noisy. Days softened. He spoke of Dulcinea one evening the way a farmer speaks of rain that has already fallen on a neighbour's field without envy, with gratitude that the world still knows the habit. "If I served her poorly," he said, "let my repentance serve a better lady." I did not say Aldonza aloud. Some names are holier when kept in the pocket with a crumb of bread. I tended Rocinante in the yard. He nosed my shoulder, searching for a carrot I did not have, and accepted instead the part of the carrot that is promise. Ruccio, satisfied with a life properly named, slept standing, and wrote in his dreams the small poems donkeys share among themselves. I mended a girth, and while my hands practiced an old honesty, I listened to the window where the housekeeper turned grief into errands, and the niece washed spoons as if they were sins. The notary returned for signatures that teach paper how to be iron. My master signed, rested, and signed again. He thanked the priest for prayers, the barber for kindness, Sanson for a correction delivered more gently in the end than at the start. He thanked me for walking alongside the better man I had sometimes tried to improve by clumsy means. You kept a hand on my hope when I could not, he said. If there is a richer wage than that sentence, I have not seen it minted. But we still wonder whether a life that misnamed a few mills but fed a few neighbors weighs light or heavy on the right scale. If dreams waste bread, they are thieves. If they teach the hand to share the crust, perhaps they are labor by another name. The line between folly and faith is as narrow as the plank over our village well. Cross with a steady eye, and it will hold. Toward the week's end, the fever spent itself like a poor man settling a bill, everything on the table, nothing left for wine. My master's mind had become a clear pane. Through it you could see a man who, once dressed for giants, now dressed for truth. He called us all close. He asked forgiveness where his zeal had bruised affection. He gave it where our affection had bruised zeal. If I have any banner left, he said, it is yours. Carry it as kindness. He slept. We kept watch the way neighbors do badly and well, nodding and starting, grateful for work that requires only presence. At dawn, one of those tidy ones God ties with a pale ribbon. The breathing paused between words and did not begin the next sentence. The room did the courtesy of being quiet without being cruel. I touched his hand. It had the serenity of a field newly watered. The housekeeper cried the small, efficient cry of those who must think of supper even today. The niece laid her cheek to the sheet, as if listening for instructions. Outside, a cart went by and did not know it was an epitaph. We buried him with modesty, which fit him at last like a well-cut coat. Sanson composed words for the stone, something about wisdom found late, and valor untaught by books alone. The villagers passed, hat to heart, and the children who had watched him tilt at crows with sticks when he was better, asked whether the knight would ride again after lunch. He has gone where lances are not needed, I told them, but you may still practice mercy, which is a weapon with no enemy. When the house quieted, I went to the yard. I tied new bells to Rocinante's mane, not to call him, but to remember how we listened when the world said adventure with a mouth full of wind. I rubbed Ruccio's ears and asked him if we might yet keep a small part of the promise, to be shepherds for a season, to learn the music that doesn't require applause. He leaned his head against me, a consent modest enough to pass for wisdom. I visited Teresa. We spoke of shawls and chickpeas, of Sanchica and her questions, of roofs that still keep rain on the respectable side of the tiles. I told her I had been a governor long enough to resign before pride ruined the salary. She kissed my foolishness and my prudence in the same motion, as wives do when they have decided to keep you. We set a pot to simmer. Because grief and legumes require time equally. And now, if you will permit a squire one last inventory, here is what our story leaves in a poor man's pockets. A basin that served as helmet and bowl, polished by courage and onions in equal measure. A name returned to its plainer name, Alonzo Quixanaclean, as a shirt dried in honest sun. A handful of proverbs that still know when to stop. A friendship that walked two men back and forth across a bridge, too narrow for either alone. And a year ahead, perhaps, in which a shepherd's staff can be government enough for a heart that has learned what bread weighs and what glory costs. The village resumes its modest weather. Children stretch their shadows in the afternoon and find they have grown since morning. The press in Barcelona still bites paper and releases it wiser. The sea keeps reciting the same lesson without boredom. Somewhere a tinker mends a pot by making two holes and filling one. Somewhere a hen forgives the dawn for being punctual. If you ask me what became of Dulcinea, I will answer as a man answers about rain it falls where it must. And the fields that learn gratitude grow wheat enough for neighbours. In these last slow breaths of our tale, let us speak softly. A man dreamed and erred and repaired, and the repair was the better gift. He taught his squire to see double without going blind, to call a basin and still polish it like a helm when a friend's dignity requires ceremony. He taught a village to measure not only grain, but gentleness. He taught me that governing begins at the rim of your own bowl and ends where your neighbour's hunger stops. So let us set the bowl down, still warm, and close our door without closing our hearts. If you have heard in this long road a music you can carry, take it to your table, let it sweeten your justice and salt your mercy. And if night finds you doubtful between milling the wind and kneading the bread, choose bread, and invite the wind to cool it. Listen only a whisper now. Keep a little dream in your pocket, not to spend against truth, but to guide your hand toward goodness when truth is cold. Walk kindly. Pay your debts. Lift a friend's hope when it stumbles, and when the world asks for your name, say it plainly, and then if you must add the name you are still learning to deserve.